All right, looks like we are live. Welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donnie.
Oh, and I'm your co-host, Matt.
Awesome. I want to thank everybody for being here for tonight's epic event. Tonight we have Dr. Kent Hovind and Jackson Rowe here, who will be debating the important question, is there evidence for human evolution? Jackson, Kent, thank you so much for giving us your time for tonight's important debate.
And if you're not yet subscribed, I wanted to remind everybody, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to check out the official website at standingfortruthministries.com. You can find it in the description box below with endless content and material.
Awesome. I appreciate that. Matt, let's break the ice here. Just one second. I hear slight feedback. Oh, actually, Matt, I think it's coming from your end. Maybe just make sure that, it looked good there. Maybe echo cancellation. Let's kind of break the ice as we usually do. Get to know the debaters a little bit before we get into the opening statements. Again, Jackson, Kent, thanks for being here. Why don't we start with let's start with you, Jackson. It's been a little while since you've been on the channel. Yeah. How you been? Tell the audience a little bit about you and a little bit about your channel.
All right, I'm good. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I've known about Kent for probably 14 years. So I'm excited to meet him. I'm kind of a fan in a weird way. But my channel's called Jackson Rowe Science Show. Just kind of rhymes. I haven't really been doing much on it lately, but after the debate, I'll make some kind of analysis of this debate, whether I win or lose, tie, whatever. I'm into science, nature, photography, stuff like that. I'm trying to start a conservation organization. It's I actually bought some land in Madagascar to help conserve some endangered lemurs. That's what I've been up to recently. So that's pretty much it about me.
All right, I appreciate that, Jackson. I appreciate that introduction. Again, thank you so much for being here. Kent, thank you as well. A little bit about yourself, who you are, and how's everything going on at Dow.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on again. My name's Kent Hovind. I've been a Baptist preacher 47 years. I taught high school science and math for 15 years. We're building a Christian camp and science center in Lenox, Alabama, population 35, straight north of Pensacola, 70 miles. Come on down and visit. It's all free. We've had visitors from all over, 197 baptized in our lake. I believe the Bible is true, and evolution is the dumbest and most dangerous theory ever been come up with, ever. It's ridiculous to believe man came from a rock. And man's related to mosquitoes. I think that's dangerous to teach kids that. And so I've done a lot of debates on the topic of creation evolution. I just defend the Bible as being true, as it's written. God made everything in 6 days. All right.
I appreciate that intro. Kent, definitely excited for this debate. Again, to the audience, tonight's topic is there evidence for human evolution? And I'm going to go over the format real quick. So it's going to be a formal debate. We're going to be starting with 12-minute opening statements because Jackson is in the affirmative tonight. He will be starting. Then we're going to have up to 8-minute rebuttals, then an open discussion, 5-minute closing statements, and then this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We're going to have an audience Q&A. Make sure you're tagging me at Standing for Truth. Me and Matt will both be gathering questions. And as usual, I'm sure we will have a solid audience Q&A. So that being said, let's get right into this debate. We're going to hand it over to Jackson. Jackson, you have roughly 12 minutes. And whatever time the debaters don't use during their openings and rebuttals, we'll just throw into the audience Q&A. So Jackson, just make sure you unmute yourself when you're good to go. And I'll start your timer.
All right. So intro, is there evidence for human evolution? I think, yes, there is, obviously. Just to get some stuff out of the way, I'm not going to talk about the past. We all have one. I'm not going to use that against anybody as some kind of low blow. I think religion and science can be compatible. Most Christians do accept evolution. I myself am an atheist, but I don't see any reason why you can't believe in both. Also, my points are pretty out of order. I just wrote them down as I found them or thought of them. so it's going to be kind of jumbled in the beginning. I'm going to focus on fossils, genetics, and anatomy primarily. I want to make it clear, first of all, that individuals don't evolve, populations do. Like one individual isn't just going to give birth into something totally different. And evolution is not a linear process. It's not always clear what evolved into what. It's more of a web or a tree. I'm also going to talk a lot about Australopithecines because it's argued a lot by creationists that they were just an extinct species of ape, which they are apes, but they are in our lineage. It's argued that they were not bipeds. There's even a statue at the Creation Museum of one on all fours that looks just like a chimp. And also Lucy is not the only one of those. There are many specimens, but that's the one that creationists tend to jump on. So first, fossil evidence. It starts with Sahelanthropus about 7 million years ago. And there's not much known about that one, but it's still probably in our lineage. Then Auroran tungensis, about 6 to 7 million years ago, had femur structure suggesting that it walked upright, but its fossils are pretty scant. Then there's Ardipithecus, Ardipithecus cadava, and Ardipithecus ramidus. Ramidus being most complete. It had skeletal structures that indicated it walked upright at least some of the time, probably not all the time. And what I'm really going to focus on are the Australopithecines for the fossil evidence because, like I said, they focus on Australopithecines the most, creationists. They argue it's just an ape, not related to us, walked on all fours. And again, Lucy's not the only one. Probably the most famous one should be the Littlefoot fossil, which is an almost complete Australopithecus prometheus. But most people don't even know it exists. So some of the skeletal structures of the Australopithecines that indicate they did walk upright were the ankle. The ankle bones were square-shaped instead of trapezoid-shaped like a modern chimp, which is an adaptation for walking. The metatarsals indicate an arch and a stiff midfoot, unlike a modern chimpanzee or gorilla or orangutan, and more like a human. The spine was S-shaped instead of arch like a modern chimp. The rib cage was barrel-shaped, as evidenced by the big man fossil specimen of Afarensis, instead of cone-shaped like a chimp. Its pelvis was short and bowl-shaped rather than elongated like a modern great ape, non-human great ape. The femurs and knees also were angled in such a way to indicate bipedalism. However, its shoulders were robust, its walking wrists like a modern chimp, and its skull was only about 100 cc bigger brain capacity than a chimp. So we'll go on to the earlier Homo genus. Like Homo habilis, there's some debate about whether it should be an Australopithecine or not. Most say it's in the Homo genus. It has just a slightly bigger brain capacity. And from there, Homo erectus goes up. Homo neanderthalensis, which is not our ancestor, it's more of our cousin, but it had a bigger brain capacity. Now, humans and apes share a few key traits. We have the same number of bones, muscles, same number of teeth, several blood type systems in common. Regions that code for protein in the DNA are 99% similar. They can be interpreted differently as being about 80% similar if they take the whole thing into account, as this channel's pointed out correctly. But yeah, closer than any other animal in the animal kingdom. Endogenous retroviruses. There are some, I've seen this channel in particular try to rationalize how these make sense, but endogenous retroviruses are when a virus infects like a sperm cell or an egg cell. It's grafted into the genome and passed on to offspring. We share 99.8% of those with chimps, which that really only makes sense if we share a common ancestor. Diseases, we share many diseases with great apes, HIV being the most obvious one, but there was also two populations recently found of chimps that have leprosy likely passed from humans. And behavioral, I won't touch much on that, but intelligence, there have been several great apes that have learned sign language or learned to use a lexigram, to learn hundreds or even thousands of symbols to communicate. Neanderthals, I'll talk more about those later. Now, if the creation story were literally true, there are two genetic bottlenecks in our lineage, starting with Adam and Eve, and then again 1,500 years later, or 2,000 years later, with the Noah's flood, where there are only 3 pairs, Noah's sons and their wives. But genetics reveal only one major bottleneck in our history, and that's about 50 to 100,000 years ago, where the population got down to a few thousand individuals. And Francis Collins, the doctor of the Human Genome Project, who was a Christian himself, said, unfortunately, there's no evidence that we descended from Adam and Eve. Now, primate and human anatomy. Taxonomically, we are primates. We have flattened nails instead of claws. We have opposable thumbs, and our fingerprints we have fingerprints. We have binocular vision with depth perception. We have eye sockets with a cup of bone supporting the eye. We have well-developed collarbones with high shoulder mobility, and Meissner's corpuscles under the fingers, touch receptors, which is a trait we share exclusively with primates. And so that's just basically the opening statement. Is there evidence for human evolution? Yes, there is. So I'll pass it over to, I don't know how much time that was, but I'll pass it over to Kent.
I'm stuck behind stage. I can't move you over. Sorry.
Oh.
On you there?
Yeah, start your slideshow, Doc.
Okay, let me get the right slide number here.
Sorry, guys, I was on mute. Jackson, let me just jump in here. We still got 4 minutes that we can throw into the either the discussion or the audience Q&A. So I appreciate that, and we will hand it over to Dr. Hovind when you're ready. You have 12 minutes.
Okay, let's see. Alt DV 965 enter. Mind showing? Oh, I got okay, good. Well, thank you, Jackson. I appreciate that. I think you are totally wrong on all those things. All those evidences you gave are evidences for creation, evidences for a really smart designer. So I look forward to getting you corrected and get over on the creationist side. We need help over here. Okay, I think all these so-called cavemen that they put out on screen and teach the kids in school is absolute baloney. None of this is science. There is no evidence that anybody has ever produced anything other than a human. No dogs produce anything but dogs. No cows produce anything but cows. For you to imagine that it happened long ago and far away is religion. It's not science. The Bible says, knowing this first, there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lust and saying, where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. For this they willingly are ignorant. They're willingly ignorant of how God made the heavens. They're ignorant of the creation. They're ignorant of the flood. The world was overflowed with water, and they're ignorant of the coming judgment. So in my ministry, in my seminar, we focus on those 3 things: the creation, the flood, and the coming judgment. The creation is very clear in the scriptures anyway. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. I don't know if Jackson believes that or not, but that's what it says. That's the first verse, and a whole lot of people believe that. Jesus said about that in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus is God Almighty in the flesh. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him. So the Bible clearly teaches that Jesus is God, and Jesus made everything. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. That would be Jesus Christ. So Colossians 1, by him, that's Jesus, were all things created. So Jesus is God Almighty in the flesh, and he's the creator of everything. And Jesus said in Matthew 19:4, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Talking about Adam and Eve. Jackson, do you believe that? Or was Jesus lying? Was he stupid? You say you tend to believe both. I don't think you realize what a conflict you have there. Jesus said the creation of Adam was the beginning. Mark 10:6. From the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. So Jesus said the beginning of the creation was when God made Adam and Eve. Since he's the one who did it, he ought to know. He's the one who was there. He was there when it happened. The Bible clearly teaches in Romans chapter 5, by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. Talking about Adam and Eve's sin. Why do we have death in the world? With your religion, Jackson, death brought man into the world. Death is actually the hero. Because if one species, if one ape or creature or whatever, ape-like creature, evolves a little better than the rest of them have to die. Evolution is a religion of death. The Bible says, by man came death. In Adam, all die. It could not be more clear, 1 Corinthians 15. So Adam's sin also affected the plants and the animals. It's clear from Genesis chapter 3. You can read all that on your own there. Okay. So Jesus said the beginning of the creation was when God made Adam and Eve. The Bible says nothing died until Adam sinned. Could not be more clear, okay? In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is. The question is not what does it say? The question is, do you believe what it says? This is Exodus 20. God wrote that on a rock with his finger. God told Moses, he wrote it on a rock with his finger, handed the rock to Moses. Moses came down the mountain, got mad at the people and broke them, had to go back up and get more. This time God said, Moses, you write it. So he gave him the rock and Moses etched it into the rock. But either way, it's the same words. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth. Do you believe that, Jackson? Did he make everything in heaven and earth, stars, everything in 6 days? Well, then there's no time and no need for evolution. Exodus 31, he repeated it. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth. So if your theory is true, that man evolved from some kind of primate, then you're calling these verses a lie. Just so you're welcome to do that, but I want you to be real clear, and I want everybody else to see you are going directly against what God's word clearly teaches. Over and over in the Bible, it talks about the 6 days of creation. 6 days, God made everything. It could not be more clear. 1 Corinthians, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The Bible is clear that Adam was the first man. And Genesis 3, Eve was the mother of all living. That's what it says. Now, do you believe it or not? If you choose not to believe it, that's fine. This is America, the land of the free and the home of the slave, but you are welcome to believe whatever you want. However, I don't want you to make people think that you believe the Bible and you believe in human evolution. You cannot have both, Jackson. One of them is wrong, okay? Wrong. Eve was the mother of all living. Jesus said the creation of Adam was the beginning. Was he lying? Bible says nothing died until man sinned. Is that true? Or do you believe that's wrong? Do we need you to interpret that book for us? Bible says we all came from Adam and Eve. Do you believe that? I do. And I'm not ashamed of that. Let us make man in our image. So God made man in his own image. That's what it says. Is God a chimp or an ape? So what about all these so-called cavemen that they teach our kids about in school? Is this Grandpa? I got a huge collection of biology books right here. They teach that. Oh, yeah, we came from an ape-like ancestor. Is it possible for an ape-like creature to slowly turn to a human? Well, it happened with Bill Clinton, but okay. So textbooks teach billions of years ago there was a big bang where nothing exploded and became everything. Nothing. Then it cooled down and became a rock. Then those rocks, it got rained on and turned into soup, and the soup came alive and slowly evolved into something like a primate, and then slowly became man. So here we are, way back here, 4.6 billion years ago. Actually, Big Bang was 13.772, as they get a new number every week. But that's what they teach. And here we are up today, primates, man. I think people are welcome to believe this, but you need to clearly understand you are going directly against what God said in his word. If you choose not to believe it, that's fine for now. But someday every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father, coming soon to a city near you, okay? Since by man came death, so did man bring death into the world, or did death bring man into the world? Just because they can draw lines on paper connecting all these things does not mean anything, Jackson. Drawing lines on paper is not scientific evidence. Claiming that we have an ancestor that was single-celled and slowly became the chordatas and then eventually human, that's not science. All of the so-called cavemen that they talk about have been disproven. We could talk about the individual ones, but a much bigger picture I want people to see. Rather than take time talking about all these so-called cavemen, Australopithecus afarensis and Lucy and all this kind of stuff, The bigger picture is nobody ever sees any humans today produce babies that are other than human. Nobody ever sees monkeys produce babies that are other than monkeys. Nobody ever sees chimpanzees produce anything other than baby chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas. It goes on and on. It's not observable. So for you to claim that we have some kind of common ancestor because they find similarities in the skulls or similarities in the bone structure, the hip structure, the wrist structure, stop. Why doesn't it happen today? It's never observed. Science, the word science comes from the Latin word "scire," which means to know. What do we know? A more expanded definition is, what do we know based upon observation, experimentation, and testing? We know from a whole lot of observation that humans produce humans. That's a lot of observation as verified. That's been an experiment that's been verified many times. Okay, I verified it 3 times myself. I got 3 kids. They were all human. So you can do the experiment yourself, Jackson. If you and your wife have a baby, it'll be a human. I'd bet you $5 on that one. So, and if you get some pet chimpanzees, when they have babies, it'll be a chimpanzee. There is no evidence, none, of anything other than that ever happening. So for you to rely on some kind of fossils, that's secondary evidence, very low quality evidence. First of all, no fossils would count for anything in a court of law. If you brought a fossil in and said, Your Honor, see this bone right here? This is evidence that it became a human. Any freshman law student could say, Your Honor, he found a bone in the dirt. You don't know that's the daddy of anybody. They say this one, he's the daddy of us all. Come on now. That's silly. You don't know it's the daddy of anybody. When you find bones in the dirt, really all you know is it died. You don't know it had any children. You sure don't know it had children that lived. And you really don't know it had children that were different. No animal today produces children that are different. Why do you think it can happen from a bone in the dirt? This is not science. Evolution, the belief in that it came from an ape-like ancestor, is not part of science. It's part of a religious belief, a worldview. You're welcome to have that. But stop calling it science, and certainly stop requiring all the kids to learn that. Smithsonian did an article. This is the mother of us all mammals. You don't know that's the mother of anybody, first of all. If you find a bone in the dirt, you know it died. End of story. Could you prove those bones had any children that lived? No. You don't know it had any kids. You don't know it had any kids that lived, that's for sure. You can't prove it had kids that lived and reproduced. You don't know that it produced kids that were different than itself. Why do evolutionists claim some bone in the dirt can do something that no animal today can do? Not one living species of anything can do what you guys are claiming. Produce something other than its kind. So they will quickly run, I'm sure Jackson will too, run behind, well, it takes millions of years. Oh, so in other words, so we don't observe it. Therefore, it's not science. We don't observe it. It's not observable scientific. And so believe that if you want. Every farmer in history will tell you that cows produce cows and corn produces corn. There are no exceptions, none, zero, zip, nada. It doesn't happen. Now, they want to talk about cavemen. It depends what you mean by a caveman. Many people today live in caves. Osama bin Laden, the world's most wanted caveman. There's a former caveman. They finally got him, I think. There's people today living in caves. That's not proof of anything. It's all over the world this way. Someone's trying to make a monkey out of you. National Pornographic or Geographic. This is all pure baloney. Humans should talk like chimps. Oh, that'd be brilliant. Why don't you all go to school? Ooh, 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 ooh. Yeah, everybody think you're sharp, won't they? Yep. Society of London is looking for volunteers to talk chimp in their everyday work and home to test the theory.
1 minute.
Society of London. Are they going around talking like chimps? Do they poop in the street too? I mean, chimps will do that, you know. Come on, guys. One part of the survey recommends waving your arms, brandishing objects, and making yourself appear larger to assert authority over others. You got to be kidding. BBC News? 15 years ago, I doubt they outgrew it. Let's see. Hello, a simple hello when greeting friends should be replaced with an extended and throaty pant. All of these so-called none of them count, Jackson. None of you can go ahead and talk about all your similarities between these different cavemen. I'm telling you, from a much larger perspective, none of them count. They're bones in the dirt. You don't know they had any kids. Show it to show me where it's happening today. I want to see that. Now that would be science. Go ahead, Jackson.
All right. Perfect timing. I appreciate that opening statement, Dr. Hovind. I appreciate the opening statements from the both of you. We're now moving into the rebuttal round. We've got up to 8 minutes, but just like the opening statement, Jackson, whatever you don't use, we will just throw into either the discussion or the audience Q&A. Also, to the audience, thank you so much. Either tag myself or Matt. Matt is the one gathering all the questions right now. We've already got a ton of questions coming in, so this is definitely going to be a lot of fun. So, Jackson, I'm going to hand it over to you. I was going to mention there was a slight humming noise during your opening statement, but I'm not hearing it right now, so I think you might have dealt with it.
Yeah, I think it's the fan on the laptop.
Okay. I don't hear it anymore, so everything sounds good, Jackson. Whenever you're ready, you got up to 8 minutes.
All right. You mentioned a lot of things like dogs only give birth to dogs and humans only give birth to humans. And, well, of course they do. No one's arguing they don't. That's not what evolution is teaching. And I think you know that, surely. Talked about the flood. There's no real direct evidence of the global flood, recent flood. Adam and Eve. Jesus talked about Adam and Eve, and sure, he did, but he could have been speaking about the allegory about Adam and Eve, not necessarily the literal interpretation of Adam and Eve, so you can still believe in both. Now, you talked about Bible verses, all those Bible verses, I think they can be allegorical, and still evolution can be true, and there can still be a God and even a Jesus. Now, let me see. It's hard to read my handwriting. Ape-like creature into a human. Yeah, not in one generation. It doesn't just happen overnight or in one generation. Of course, a human is not going to give birth to something totally different. It takes millions of years. That's what evolution teaches. That's why there's such a long time frame. Slight changes over generations add up to big changes when you look down the line. One person speaking Latin didn't give birth to a person speaking Spanish. You know, I think you're doing a lot of oversimplifications. You're talking about the links, the lines on paper. Except those lines on paper are linked by fossils and genetics, not just some guy drawing it. And you talked about disproven ape man, but you didn't really go into it. I'm assuming you're talking about like Nebraska man and Piltdown man, which were disproven by science themselves. Things like Lucy, the big man, Littlefoot, those fossil specimens, they haven't been disproven or discredited in any way. Again, it's hard for me to read my handwriting. Give me a second. You talk about fossils and bones in the court of law. Well, how do murder cases happen then? I mean, you find bones, you infer how those bones passed away by what you find on the bones. You can determine the sex of the victim. You can look at the DNA sometimes, not often with fossils, but so in a court of law, of course, you use bones. I think you're deliberately misrepresenting what evolution teaches here. I don't think you're doing it to be a bad guy or anything. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. But basically, that was more of a theological point of view, and I don't have too much to say about that. So that's basically my rebuttal. Probably shorter than the time allotted, but anyway, that's about it.
No worries, Jackson. You take what you need to. That's why we give you a maximum time frame as compared to, you know, something that you have to utilize all of. That way we'll just, let me see how much you used. So we got about another 4 minutes that we can throw into either. What we'll do is we'll throw two minutes into the discussion, 2 minutes into the audience Q&A, because the audience Q&A is always a lot of fun. So that being said, we're going to hand it over to Dr. Hovind now. Dr. Hovind, you have 8 minutes, and whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I mentioned that dogs produce dogs, and you said, of course, dogs produce dogs. Do you believe at some time in the past, at some point, the dog came from something that was non-dog? I mean, the lines on paper show actually a single-celled ancestor turning into what eventually would be those with the backbone, which include the dog. So at some point in your theory, you would have to say that a non-dog produced a dog. And you said it took millions of years. That's not science. It's not observable. That's my point. You guys can believe this all you want, but it's not science. You don't get it. It's part of a religion. So the secret of how life on Earth began. Today, life has conquered every square inch of Earth. But when the planet formed, it was a dead rock. How did life get started? Well, that's a fair question. Now, this debate tonight is just about the so-called common ancestors of humans. Did man evolve? And again, drawing lines on paper between all these creatures claiming they're connected is not science. You said something about the bones. They can tell when they find bones of a murder victim, whether it was male or female, and et cetera, about approximate age. Well, that wasn't my question. My question was, can you from the bones tell it had any children? And can you tell it had children that were different than itself? From the bones, could you tell this animal produced something that was different than what itself was, whether it be human or chimp or ape or something like that? So arranging bones on a shelf is not evidence either of anything, okay? It's just a matter of, good organization skills, arranging things. We've got copies of most of the replicas of the so-called ancestors here. I'm telling you, all of them are either fully ape or fully human. There is no such thing as anything in between. Let me get up to where I wanted to get. Hang on, right here. Nope. All right, there. Neanderthal man, for an example, okay? You said some had not been disproven. I didn't see 1031. Alt DV 1030, okay. On my video number 2 of my seminar series, which is 18 hours you can get for $50, and then you can return it and get your money back. I used to loan stuff out. I quickly learned Baptists don't steal, but they do borrow and never return. So buy it, and then you can get your money back when you return it. So they have all these so-called cavemen, Homo sapien, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, lined up on for textbook. This is the stuff we're teaching the kids in school. I resent that. It's not science. It's a religious belief. This stuff ought to go in a private school where you want to teach kids that monkeys, they say the brain was bigger. So I think it proved they lived longer. And we could take each one of the cavemen if you'd like. But the bigger point is, Jackson, none of the cavemen would count. None of the bones would count in an honest court of law to find out, could they produce children that were different than themselves? Could you tell from the bone whether it was male or female? Possibly. Certainly from the hip bone, you can tell that, but I don't know about the finger bone. Maybe you can. The so-called Neanderthals, they say they had a bigger brow ridge. What does that mean? Homo sapien came from Neanderthal. Well, let's see. Neanderthals. What does it mean to be human? I got a ton of stuff on that. Itchy eyes, sneezing, may blame the allergy on Neanderthals. And they draw these pictures like they have the bigger brow ridge. Well, the Bible says before the flood came, the people lived to be 900 years old, average 912. After the flood, it dropped off to 400 years and then down to 200. And today, hardly anybody makes it to 100. Well, the fact is, a simple anatomy course would tell you, your brow ridge never stops growing. As you chew, the masseter muscle and the temporalis muscle and the frontalis muscle pull on the brow ridge just from the chewing action. So if you're chewing, any bodybuilder will tell you, when you use a muscle a lot, it builds bigger bone. The muscle pulling on the bone stimulates bone growth. So chewing for a long time would stimulate bigger brow ridge. So if somebody's living to be 800 or 900, they get a bigger brow ridge. It has nothing to do with being Neanderthal or ape-like or anything else. They lived a long time. This guy sent me his picture. Said, Brother Hovind, look at me. I'm Neanderthal, and I love your videos. So here's a Christian Neanderthal man. He's still alive in Philadelphia, by the way. How about David Harbour? Is he Neanderthal with a big brow ridge? Is he half human, half ape, or is he fully human? 20 physical traits you might have inherited from Neanderthal. The hump on the back of the skull, the occipital bun. Well, that's when you bend over and pull yourself up, the muscles on the back of your neck, sternocleidomastoid, et cetera, they pull on your head, your skull. Of course, it's going to elongate after a while. These muscles are what's pulling your head back up when you bend over. So again, if you live to be 900, you'd have bigger brow ridge on the front and bigger occipital bun on the back. The bones senses these small changes and can grow dramatically. In the months after starting exercise, in order to reduce the risk of breaking near the joints, bones get bigger and more dense, where bone shafts tend to get bigger and thicker with little change in body density. The brow ridge never stops growing, so just finding one like this indicates it's probably a human living to be 200 or 300 or 500. That's all. Pronounced brow ridge is a common feature among Paleolithic humans. Early modern people, such as those from the finds of someplace here, had thick, large brow ridges, but they differ from those of archaic humans, like Neanderthals, have a suborbital foramen or notch, so forming a groove through the ridge of each above each eye. So you can read all about this. It's not evidence of anything. Here's a soccer player, got a pretty good sized brow ridge. How about that guy? Does that prove he's half human, half ape? How about this guy? Or this guy? Raising eyebrows, how evolution gave us expressive faces. These guys are desperate. So I think, Jackson, I'd like you to try to see, first of all, the little bones that we find with slight differences from ours is not evidence that they're related to us at all. And there are no examples in recorded history of all the farmers in the world who crossbreed cows. They'll all tell you they get a cow. How many seeds have been planted over the last 4,000 years, either by humans or by nature? I mean, just the grass produces billions of seeds. They blow around and they grow into grass. There are simply no examples of any plant or animal ever producing anything other than its kind. Now, if you wish to believe that, that's fine. But, Jackson, your position is directly against all the observed scientific evidence, and it is certainly against the clear teaching of Scripture. And for you to claim that Jesus saying Adam and Eve were just an allegory, that's your religious belief, but that's not what the Scripture clearly teaches. Jesus said the creation of Adam was the beginning. Was it or wasn't it? Bible says nothing died till Adam sinned. Is that true? In your religion, a bunch of people have to die in order for this evolution to work. If one creature evolves a little better than the rest of them got to die, or else the new improved gene gets blended back into the population. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's wicked to teach kids evolution. I think you're wrong. Anyway, go ahead.
All right, gentlemen, that concludes the opening statements and the rebuttals. Now we are moving into the open discussion. As always on this channel, we prefer to keep these discussions civil, professional, equally timed, and of course, discussing one topic at a time. Before I hand it to Jackson, since Kent just ended his rebuttal, Jackson, we'll let you start the discussion off. Maybe there's a couple points you wanted to make, followed up by a question. But before I hand it to you, logical, plausible, probable, John Maddox, he sent in a few super chats. I appreciate it, brother. He is having an after show. So as soon as this debate is over, everybody in the chat, head on over to John's channel. We've got about 300 people in the chat enjoying this epic debate. So that being said, Jackson, Kent, the floor is yours.
All right. So you mentioned the beginning of life, and that's not really what we're debating here. And it really doesn't have too much to do with evolution, really. Because God could have produced the first cell and evolution could still have happened. Now you said fully ape and fully human. That doesn't really make any sense from like a genetic or anatomy point of view. We're still fully ape. We just have a bit more advanced features than some of the other great apes. But
one topic at a time. Which one you're supposed to talk about? You already gave your statement. Now, which one topic do you want to ask me about?
Oh, I'll just ask a question. What evidence would change your mind, do you think?
Oh, the truth. I'm looking for the truth. The truth is, all we ever see is humans produce humans. So that would lead me to the conclusion that humans have always come from humans. Going forward, we know it'll always be humans. Going backward, I think it's logical to say it must have always been humans going backwards, which means there must have been a beginning human, Adam and Eve. So you don't have to have, I mean, what would change your mind about 2 + 2 = 4? What evidence could I give you that would change your mind about that?
Well, about 2 + 2 = 4, nothing would change my mind. But if someone found...
I'm not changing mine either.
Okay, well, listen, if you found a fossil of a human in Cambrian era rock, that would change my mind pretty quick.
Well, do you believe, and the chimpanzees are ape-like creatures that we came from, had an ancestor before that? According to the textbooks, it'll say, if you just remember the word farm, F-A-R-M, fish became amphibians, became reptiles, became mammals. Fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal. Do you believe that theory?
Well, it's not that simple. I mean, it kind of is a branch. It's not a linear process, and it's not really. I mean, there are a lot of fossils that show the sea to land transition. There's Epistles, which was unveiled not long ago. There's Tiktaalik, of course, which is the major one that people know about. There's Acanthostega, Ichthyostega. I mean, there's a series of fossils for every line of major transitions that we know about.
So hang on now. Fossils show a series of transitions. That would only be because somebody arranged them in that order. The fossils don't talk. I think we'd agree with that. And the fossils don't reproduce. So you're going to have to put your interpretation on them. Arranging things in order does not prove relationship. Arranging a unicycle to a bicycle to a tricycle to a quad runner does not prove anything. Go from one wheel to two wheel to three wheel to four wheel. So each one is independently designed. So all of these, that's what I'm trying to get across. All of these fossils you're talking about would be thrown out of any honest court of law. You'd say, you don't know they had any children. We don't see anything today producing other than their kind. Why do you think these bones could do it?
Well, the bones obviously didn't reproduce at all, but they're arranged by where they were found in the strata, the age of the bones, of the fossils, not just by, well, this one looks like it's turning into this. It's not that simple. And there was a trial like this, the Dover trial, and creationism lost pretty badly.
I think if I recall, the Dover trial was simply to say, should creation be taught in public schools? And I think they demonstrated, no, creation is a religious belief. I would agree. Should evolution be taught in public schools? No, because evolution is also a religious belief. The bigger question is, should we even have public schools? Should every parent teach their own kids, or should churches have their own schools or something? But if we're going to have public schools, they shouldn't teach one religion over another, but that's what they're doing. They're teaching the evolution religion over everything else. I think that's wicked. I think that's wrong. I think it ought to be stopped. So you mentioned, let's see, the fossils were arranged by their age and the strata. All of the layers of the earth are the same age. Every speck of dirt on the planet's the same age, unless it came from an asteroid or something, and there's very little of that on the planet. All of the layers, there's no such thing as a geologic column. The whole thing's a joke. If you shuffle a deck of cards, is the top card younger? If you shake a jar of dirt, it'll settle up into gravel, sand, clay every time. The shaking and sorting of the fossils might be arranged based upon their intelligence or based upon their habitat. You know, clams are found at the bottom because they're already at the bottom when the flood starts. Of course, they're buried first. Birds are found at the top because birds are the last ones to drown in a flood. The fact that clams are here and birds are here does not prove clams turn to birds. It proves that birds can fly around till they run out of gas and then they get buried. Of course, they're on top of the clams. You guys just don't get it. You trust that stupid geologic column. It doesn't exist anywhere on the planet except in their imagination. It's not science. So to say they arrange these so-called missing links that you're talking about, putting things in some kind of order that you've already decided it must have happened, that's prejudice. It's not science. We never see any of these fossils that you're talking about. They're not alive today. We can't test it. We can't demonstrate it. You can't show them producing anything other than their kind. Why do you want to believe it happened? I guess I'd like to ask you a separate question. But why do you want to believe this, Jackson? Are you running from God's word for some reason, or?
Well, of course I'm not running from it. That's what the evidence seems to show. And you say the geologic column doesn't exist anywhere on Earth. Is that right?
That's correct. It's in the textbook. It's the only place it exists.
Well, from Precambrian to present, there's nowhere where it lines up like that anywhere?
There's no such thing as Precambrian. All of those names they give them, Jurassic, Triassic, Mississippian, Devonian, Silurian, it doesn't exist. It's all baloney. They're layers of rock.
Right.
Somebody put their name on them, and somebody put a date on them. I don't think the rock cares what we call it or how old it is. This geologic column does not exist.
Right. Okay. You're saying it literally doesn't exist anywhere, or doesn't exist.
Oh, I'm not saying
as it
the
ages.
Earth does have lots of layers. No question. We got them right here in our gravel pit in Alabama.
Okay.
But I'm saying they're not different ages, and those names they put on them are meaningless. There's no such thing as a Jurassic period. All of those layers were formed in one big flood in the days of Noah, or nearly all of them. Some layers formed today, but I'd say, I'll give it a pick a number and say 95% of the layers of the Earth were made in Noah's flood in 1 year. By the tide coming up and down and rushing back and forth, up, down, back, forth. Noah was in the ark for 880 tidal changes. And if you get a liquid covered planet like during Noah's flood, the tide becomes harmonic. It'll go up and down 200 feet instead of going up and down 5 feet like the tide does today. So the water's got to rush in to fill that bump. Google experiments in stratification by Guy Berthold or something. It's a French name. He shows it happening. When the water's moving sideways, it'll make 6 or 8 or 10 layers at the same time. The layers form this way, not this way. I'm sorry you were taught that the layers form this way. That's just logical nonsense. If the layers are forming this way, where's this material coming from? Go ahead.
Well, there are several places on Earth where the complete geologic column are found. Like the Tunisian Basin, the Oman Interior Basin. There's a Gandamese Basin in Libya. There are about 20 more. But
no, wait a minute, now, Jackson. There are several places on Earth where the layers are in the same age that they put in the book that they claim is a geologic column. Again, you can't. The rocks in those layers aren't talking, and you cannot prove. And the layers are neatly stacked like pancakes. There's no erosion marks between them. All those layers formed in 1 year.
Well, it's just a strange coincidence. I know you guys don't give much credence to radiometric dating, but the bottom layers come out older, and it goes steadily younger as you go up. And there are multiple dating.
Who taught you that?
Well, I've seen it in many places that you don't give much credence to radiometric dating.
Well, I understand how it works pretty well, whether you want to talk carbon-14, carbon-13, potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium. We can talk about any one you'd like. I'm pretty versed on those, but all of the radiometric dating methods are based on some real obvious assumptions. If you walked into a room and found a candle burning on the table and I asked you, when was it lit? How long's the candle been burning? All you really could tell me scientifically is the current height of the candle and the current rate of burn. Let's suppose it's 7 inches tall and it's burning an inch an hour. I got 2 scientific facts. It is 7 inches tall. It's burning an inch an hour. We could all agree on that. Now, when was it lit? Well, now we got to go into some assumptions. How tall was it? Has it always burned at the same rate? Has there been any draft in the room that changed this thing? Was the candle skinnier and burned faster? We don't know. So radiometric dating, we can find a rock, we can determine the amount of potassium or the amount of carbon-14 or rubidium or strontium, whichever element you want to use. Yes, they can determine that pretty accurately. I don't argue with that. And they can determine how fast it decays. I don't argue with that. There's your 2 facts about the candle. 7 inches tall, burning an inch an hour. After that, it's guesswork. Has this fossil ever been contaminated? How much carbon-14 was in the atmosphere when that plant was alive? You can't know that. So you're taking today's carbon-14 concentration, 0.00026% or whatever it is, and assuming that that's what it was back then. You can't possibly know that. Tell you what, take me to a court of law. Let's have an honest judge and the jury. You say, I think carbon dating is accurate. I'll show the obvious assumptions. And any honest judge would say, folks, we don't know the age of anything by any of these by radiometric dating methods. Nobody, you can't tell. There's too many assumptions involved. Throw it out.
Well, you can cross-reference with radiometric dating methods, and like use several methods, and they all come out cross-referenced. They come out to around a few percent of the same age. So I think that's just an incredible coincidence.
Well, I disagree with that statement. They cross-reference the radiometric dating with what?
Other radiometric dating methods.
Here's a rock. How old is this rock?
You can't tell from just looking at it.
Bingo. Can't tell. You'd have to make some assumptions. If you take a fossil, take this clam, petrified, closed clam, to any university and say, how old is it? Their first question will be, where did you find it? What difference does it make where I found it? I want to know how old it is. They say, oh, we have to know where you found it so we can give it a geologic age based upon the geologic column. See, the layers of the Earth, this geologic column, which does not exist, those layers are dated by the fossils they contain. And the fossils are dated by the layer they're found in. Complete circular reasoning. Your Honor, throw it all out. Baloney. Honest judge? Yep, you're right. Can't use that evidence. Fossils are fossils. Petrified clams are found probably by the trillions, and they're closed. I think it indicates they were buried quickly, buried alive. Well, if my theory is correct and the flood formed all this, the water coming up from Noah's flood and rushing in to fill the bump would bring in a layer of mud 50 feet thick in 10 seconds and would bury the clam beds alive. Why are petrified closed clams found on top of Mount Everest and on top of many of the mountains around the world? I can answer that. The Bible's true. The flood did it. So there's no such thing as a geologic column. There's no other way to corroborate the age of the rocks or fossils. Radiometric dating has real obvious assumptions. You have to throw that out. So even if the bones you found were X number of thousand or million years old, you still don't know they had any children that lived or that were different than themselves. No farmer's ever seen this, Jackson. Nobody. It's not observable. It's not science. Science, what we can observe, study, test, demonstrate. Evolution is not science in any stretch of the imagination.
Well, I can answer why there are clams on the top of the Mount Everest. It's plate tectonics. It's not necessarily a global flood. So there are two explanations for that that work just fine depending on the way you look at it, I guess. But
that's not an explanation. That's a possible explanation. I agree the mountains are lifting up. I agree the plate tectonics, the Earth's crust is moving. I agree. I've never said, and I won't say, that the water was over Mount Everest during Noah's flood. Mount Everest was not there. Psalm 104 says at the end of the flood, the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the water rushed off. So at the end of the flood, the liquid-covered planet got rearranged by crustal movement, and the crust of the Earth is still moving around. I taught her science 15 years. There's major fault lines everywhere. San Andreas Fault, Hayward Fault, New Madrid Fault. None of them are my fault, but I've studied them, been there, looked at them. No question. But that doesn't prove it's been going on for millions of years. Rapid plate tectonics can happen where the crust, a section of the Earth the size of Texas can tilt half a mile. The water's going to run off and make an ocean here and mountain range here. I think all the mountain ranges in the world follow the coastlines. Might not be just a coincidence. Maybe there was a flood. So I think you're finding these fossils. The argument tonight, the debate tonight, is about human evolution. My position is there is no evidence of any animal ever producing anything that was more human than itself. Dogs produce dogs. Cows produce cows. You have any evidence of anything other than that, these fossils you're finding, or at least you're arranging in some kind of order, would not count as evidence at all anywhere. Not an honest court of law, anyway. Go ahead.
Well, kind of lost my train of thought.
Well, we can take questions.
What were you saying again?
I'm saying there is no evidence of any animal or plant producing anything other than its kind. So for you to say these fossils they found could do that is a religious belief on your part. We don't observe cows today produce non-cows or even 2% better cows. I mean, it's cow all the way, 100%. So you're arranging these fossils is not part of science. It's part of a religious prejudice.
Of course, nothing ever gave birth to something else, but each generation does have slightly different genetics. I mean, there's variation in the genome. There's, you have slight changes over one generation. Look down, a million generations, and what do you think it's going to look like?
All right. We have watched hundreds of generations of humans. People have observed it, and they're always human. We have been able in the laboratory to watch probably millions of generations of bacteria because they have a generation time of 20 minutes. They get born, grow up, get married, and have kids in 20 minutes. So you can watch bacteria over certainly hundreds of thousands of generations, and they always produce bacteria. Nothing else ever than a bacteria. Where are the 2-celled, 3-celled, 4-celled organisms And where is the evidence of any creature, bacteria to whale, producing something other than its kind? For you to say, oh, it happens slowly over generations, that's a religious belief, Jackson. You don't see that. That's not science. Sorry.
Well, I forget what the actual experiment's called, but the experiments with E. coli, and there are 6 cultures, I believe. I may be wrong about that. They are raising up and have been watching for thousands of generations. They think that one may be a different species now. They're not 100% sure on that, but one of them metabolizes some enzyme that the other ones can't. I forget what it is exactly, the details, but yeah, they're not the same as when they began.
So somebody's calling it a different species. Well, a dog and a wolf are different species, but they're the same kind of animal. Okay. The Bible uses the word kind 20 times in the first 7 chapters, 10 times in the first chapter. So God said they'll bring forth after their kind. Is this creature you're talking about still this? Would a 4th grader or 4-year-old still call it the same kind? The fact that it's now able to metabolize some enzyme. So I don't like onions. My wife does. What does that prove? Nothing. Both still human. So I think the changes, you guys are desperately looking for any kind of evidence to support your theory that you already chose. You want to believe this. You want to believe that Jesus was lying when he said Adam was the first man. You really want to call him a liar. That's my guess. Go ahead.
Well, I don't feel any way about Jesus as a person. I think he had some good teachings. I'm not looking to make him a liar. I just think what's in the Bible is not literally true.
But that was my point. You don't want the Bible to be literally true for whatever reason. And so you've chosen to believe, capital B, believe, this evolution story that they're telling. Well, that's fine. But I wish you guys would admit it's a religious belief and a choice on your part instead of calling it science when it's not.
Well, when multiple religions accept evolution, how do you have 2 religions? I mean, that doesn't really make any sense. You can't be, I mean, Catholics accept evolution. How are you a Catholic and an evolutionist if evolution is religion?
A religion is something people believe in without scientific evidence to support it, would be a rough general definition. Nobody's ever seen a cow produce a non-cow, but you believe a cow came from a bacteria. What the charts show, I can show you again if you like. They show this. All of us came from a single-celled creature. I say that's not science. 8998 Alt DV. Do you believe this chart from the textbook? I forgot to put which textbook it came from. Do you believe this is accurate, that a single-celled ancestor is the ancestor of everything alive today? Starfish, grasshoppers, worms, mollusks. Do you believe that chart represents scientific evidence, or is that a religious belief?
Well, the chart is kind of an oversimplification, but yes, we did come from a single-celled organism.
Okay. Where is the evidence of any single-celled organism producing anything other than a single-celled organism? We've watched bacteria for tens of thousands of generations. It didn't work. They're still bacteria.
They recently found a fossil of Bicellum braceri, I think it's called, which is the first multicellular organism ever found in the fossil record, about 1 billion years old. Has 2 types of differentiated cells, the first step up from what would be called a single-celled organism. So,
hold it. If you found a fossil, you don't know that it's related to the single-celled organism. You don't know that it produced anything other than its kind. Let's do this in the laboratory. Get a bunch of single-celled organisms. You can use amoeba, paramecium, bacteria, whatever you want to use, and turn it to something else. They've even tried with all kinds of things to turn it to something else, and it won't do it. So it's not science. That's all.
Well, creationists didn't used to accept speciation until we proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt. But
wait, I'm trying to hear that part. You proved what beyond a shadow of a doubt?
Speciation.
Well, I would not use the word species. I'd use the word kind. Like I said, a dog and a wolf are different species. They're the same kind of animal. Show me something. It's just because some scientist decided, oh, this is far enough different than the original, we're going to call it a new species. They can no longer interbreed, like the sparrows around the North Polar region. The sparrows in Russia cannot interbreed with the sparrows in Alaska, or they normally don't interbreed. They probably could if if they've got desperate, but they're still sparrow. That's the ring species. They say at the extension of the ring species, they cannot interbreed. So it's still the same kind. Darwin saw 14 varieties of finches on the Galapagos Islands. They're still a finch, Charlie, a bird. That's not evidence for any evolution. But you guys are so desperate for evidence, you'll jump on anything like that. So the fact that somebody decided to call it a new species, I don't care. It's still the same kind. Show me something. This chart shows single-celled ancestor turning into everything today. Wow. Well, where's the science? Do that in a laboratory. I don't want to see a fossil. That doesn't mean anything. Where's it happening today?
Well, where do we draw the line at kind? Is it a family, genus? Where is it?
King Philip came over for Girl Scouts. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Go ahead.
Right, but where do we draw the line?
Oh, I don't know.
At where kind is?
I don't think anybody knows. There's not a good definition of species that's airtight either. What exactly do you mean by species? Dog and a wolf are different species, but they're interfertile. So they can't use that. Dog, wolf, coyote, hyena might have all had a common ancestor. Still look like a dog. That's not proof that dogs are related to bananas.
Let me jump in here real quick, gentlemen. We've got about 1 minute left on the discussion portion, plus hundreds of questions. But Jackson, I don't want to cut you off. So Jackson, make I guess your final point there, and we'll kind of go from there. We'll start winding it down, move into the closings in just a minute. Go ahead, Jackson.
Honestly, I forgot what I was going to say. You can go ahead.
Okay. Great discussion, gentlemen. Time's flying by. We've got a great audience, over 300 people with a ton of great questions, all pertaining to the topic. But just so we can wrap up our thoughts, wrap up final points, address anything that we feel might be left hanging, let's do 5-minute closing statements. Jackson, since you were the affirmative and you started us off in this debate, let's hand it to you. You've got 5 minutes for a closing statement, and then we'll hand it to Kent for his 5-minute closing statement.
All right. I feel like this debate kind of went on a tangent a few times. We've been talking a lot about theology and about unrelated stuff, but just basically, I feel it went pretty well. I mean, I'm not going to call myself a winner. I'm not going to call Kent Hovind a winner. I'm biased. I don't know who won. It's for the audience to decide. But I'm just going to say, go back over some of what Kent said. I think it's possible to believe in evolution and be a Christian. We're still apes. I mean, there's not a half ape or a half man. A lot of what Kent spoke of were oversimplifications or misrepresentations. There's no such thing as a fully human or a fully ape. Neanderthals he mentioned that, and I didn't really get to respond. We differ by them by 202 mitochondrial base pairs, so we are not the same species. He was talking about Neanderthal brow ridges indicating their old age. But even young Neanderthals had highly pronounced brow ridges. And we can tell they were young because they're either very small or they had very low amount of wear on their teeth. But that's pretty much all I want to address. I think the debate went pretty well. I had fun, regardless of the outcome. So I'll hand it over to Ken.
All right. Thank you, Jackson, for that closing statement. Just looking at the questions that we've got saved, we're going to have an awesome audience Q&A. So Kent, we're going to hand it over to you. Brother, you've got 5 minutes for a closing statement whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you. His statement that I used oversimplifications and misrepresentation, let me translate that for the average audience. That means he's claiming I lied. Okay, he's claiming the same thing about Jesus, that Jesus lied. God said in the beginning, he created the heaven and the earth. Jackson thinks he lied about that. That God didn't do it. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus was the Word. Jesus created all things. We talked about that. Jesus answered and said unto them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Was that a misrepresentation? Was God lying? Would he oversimplify it? No, it's the truth. My position is very clear. The Bible is scientifically accurate. It is the correct way of how we got here. There's no logical explanation for how the world got here to begin with, how life got started, and how all these different varieties came about. God created them. And they've been, ever since he made them, they've been producing after their kind. They've been making a lot of variations. There's now, several different colors of humans, but they're still human. Some have curly hair, some have straight hair. They're still hair. No, none are growing feathers. So I think the evidence shows clearly that, like Jesus said, from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. He didn't. That's not a misrepresentation. That's how it happened. So my position is just like I started. I think the Bible is true. God made the world in 6 days. It was destroyed by a flood. And the scoffers in the last days, let's see slide number 971 here. The scoffers in the last days are ignorant of the creation, the flood, and the coming judgment of God. I would be very concerned for Jackson or anyone who takes his position when you die and have to stand before God. And he's going to say, look, I wrote it in a book and millions of people died over the centuries so you could have a copy of that book in your hand. Why didn't you believe it? It's very simple. God created the heaven and the earth. And God made life. God breathed into the dust and made Adam come alive. I think God can take dirt and make a human. I don't think dirt can make a human out of it by itself. I think man can take metal out of the ground and make a car. I don't think metal in the ground can make a car by itself. So my position is the same. Jesus made everything. And I accepted him as my Savior 53 years ago. And I'm going to heaven. Not that I deserve it, but I'm going because I'm forgiven. I'd like you all to watch it to get forgiven and go to heaven with me. Go ahead, brother. That's it.
All right, brother. Thank you for that concluding statement and final words. Fantastic debate. Time really flies by. We've had a great audience. Jackson as well. Thank you so much for your concluding statement. Matt as well, you're a blessing, brother, because I know that chat was wild and you did a great job saving these hundreds of questions. So we'll get through as many as we can. So I apologize ahead of time if we don't get to your question. Now, what we do on this channel is whoever the question is for, okay, they obviously get to respond first, but then we're going to give the other debater a chance to respond and add their thoughts. In order to move along smoothly, what we'll do is we'll give the whoever got the question, they get the last word. So that being said, Matt, since you saved the questions, we can take turns kind of asking them, but I'll let you pick the first question.
Okay. I will be doing all the super chats. I think there was about 9 or 10 of them there. So I just kind of went in order as much as I could, with the first one being from logical, probable, possible. And it is for both of you. If dogs always produce dogs and cats always produce cats, why do some human theists manage to produce atheists? Is this proof of evolution, perhaps? Question for Kent, I guess, first, or Jackson, whoever wants to take it, really.
I'll be glad to take it.
Okay.
Yeah, some human Christians produce atheist children. I think anybody with a brain would categorize their body as still human. They may have devolved in their brain to where they believe they came from a rock a little bit, but their body is still 100% human.
All right, Jackson. Actually, Jackson, you might be muted.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, any demographic can produce any other demographic of people. I mean, a Muslim can give birth to an atheist. Well, not everyone's born an atheist, technically. They become an atheist later in life. Or, an atheist family can have a child that becomes a Muslim, It's just how it goes. It just depends on what that individual sees as true. I guess it's really up to them.
All right. SFT, did you want to ask the next one? I'll just erase it from mine if you wanted to just choose one. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, let me I'm just picking questions at random since we've got a ton here. So this one comes in from Dwayne Burke. I appreciate the super chat, Dwayne Burke. He says, so I guess, again, it's a question for both. He says, fossils are not evidence of transitioning animals because the fossils could be A, a pre-existing kind of animal, or B, an undiscovered kind of animal. It seems like it's kind of more directed at you, Jackson. So let's start with you on that one.
All right. Well, again, we're back to kinds and what that means. But there are some transitions that are so obvious between a couple of different lineages, but it seems that there's really no other explanation. Like Myocetus in the whale, in the land to sea transition for whales. There's so many features. Its head is basically that of a basilosaurus, but its body is that of a basically fully land animal. There just aren't really a lot of explanations for animals like that.
All right, go ahead, Kent.
Well, I think the question was well worded, if I understand what he said. But yes, if you find a fossil that looks to be halfway between one and another, like Jackson said, halfway between a whale and something else. Okay, we find a fossil that's halfway between, by somebody's definition. It could be an animal that's gone extinct that never was that wasn't changing to anything else. Is a bicycle halfway between a unicycle and a tricycle? No, it's a bicycle. It's designed to be a bicycle. It has two wheels. So if there were a fossil found that somebody wants to say, oh, this is halfway transition from this to this, that's all happening in their imagination because they lined them up to change from one to another. We never see any animal change to another kind of animal. Whales have baby whales every time, no exception. Whales came from whale mom and dad. I bet their grandparents were whales too. I bet you can go way back as far as you want. It's a whale. Now, if you wish to imagine that it was something else, you're outside of science at that point. So I think you're right. If you found a fossil that looked to be exactly 50% halfway between two different creatures, you could not prove it wasn't just an extinct animal just recently now discovered by this fossil. Good question.
All right, I appreciate that answer, Jackson and Kent. Since I guess it was kind of directed at both of you, why don't we hand it to Matt? Matt, go ahead and pick the next question.
All right. It will be just a random statement because it was super chat. It will be from Logical, Probable, Possible again. He said the after show will be on his channel. There will be a link in the description box. And a question from George Bond for Jackson. How does a caterpillar without sexual organs create a butterfly in small incremental steps?
Well, it's one individual metamorphosing into something else. It's not really evolution or creation. So I don't really understand what the point they're making is.
Okay, we could just move on to another one.
Unless, Kent, if you wanted to add anything.
I think the butterfly is designed and is amazing. I praise God for the butterfly and the moth and the fact that they can come from a caterpillar. I think is just God did that kind of stuff just so someday he can get the evolutionists up in front and say, guys, you should have listened. The evidence for intelligent designer is everywhere. For a caterpillar to turn to a butterfly is amazing. I mean, stunning. I don't have a problem giving God the glory. I don't have to look for some stupid explanation for how it came from a rock. I just say, God made butterflies, did a good job.
Jackson, unless you wanted a final word since it was your question, and then we can, we'll have Matt pick the next one.
Well, I think it's amazing too. I just, have a different view on what it means, I guess.
Okay, go ahead, Matt. Next question, brother.
All right. Super chat for Kent then. From Cedric Saunders. It is, I would like to have a debate with you on the veracity of the Inca stones depicting non-avian dinosaurs cohabited with man. If you're game, I'll send you my contact info.
If I understood what you're saying, he wants to have a debate on the Ica stones. Is that what he said?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I have they're in Pensacola now, 8 of the Ica stones. Thousands have been found. Ica Peru is what they're talking about, ICA. Many books have been written on the topic, and many of these stones seem to clearly depict dinosaurs and humans together. But we don't need those stones. If the Bible is correct that man brought death into the world, nothing died till Adam sinned. Dinosaurs had to live with Adam and Eve. God said he made everything in 6 days. Everything. Dinosaurs had to live with Adam and Eve. Nothing died before man sinned. So reptiles never stopped growing, never. And it's very clear from the Bible, at least, that before the flood came, people lived to be 900 years old. I mean, that's what the book says. You can read Genesis chapter 5. So if you take an animal like a reptile that never stops growing and let him live to be 900 years old, it's going to be a dinosaur. Slide number 1062. Hang on. Alt DV 1062. I like PowerPoint. Okay. So this is from the Bible. Adam will live to be 930. Everybody before the flood's living 900 years. So the Christian perspective is dinosaurs lived from Adam up until the flood. Noah would have taken dinosaurs on the ark, probably babies. Just be sure to get a pink one and a blue one. And after the flood, when lifespans dropped off, this was problematic for the creatures that they can't live as long now. Some probably went extinct because they couldn't even live long enough to reach maturity. And so probably the big ones, died off within a couple hundred years, right away after the flood. So to find dinosaurs carved on rocks and stories of people living with dragons, I covered that for 2 hours on my video number 3, all about dinosaurs that lived with man. So my position is dinosaurs lived with Adam and Eve. Whether ichthyostones are accurate or not, I think they are, but it really wouldn't matter because there's so much other evidence. There might even be some dinosaurs alive today. There have been thousands of sightings of creatures like Mokele and Mbembe in the Congo swamp. That certainly the natives, you show the natives over there a dinosaur who've never been to school to study evolution and say, what is this? They'll say, oh, Mokele and Mbembe. Don't get close. He's not friendly. Just watch my video number 3. I cover all that. So I do believe the ichthyostones are correct and accurate. Some probably have been fakes and frauds. I mean, there's fake $100 bills too. Doesn't prove they're, well, I guess those are all fake, but never mind. That's a different story. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Kent. Jackson, if you wanted a quick response or add anything, go ahead.
All right. Well, the man who discovered the Inca stones, or some of the Inca stones anyway, admitted that some of them at least were frauds. And even Answers in Genesis doesn't use those anymore. And talking about Mokele and Mbembe, I saw a video of some pygmies in the area shown a picture of a rhino, and they said that's Mokele and Mbembe. So I don't think they really know what Mokele and Mbembe is. I think if they see an elephant, they'll say that's Mokele and Mbembe. They see a rhino, they'll say that's Mokele and Mbembe. I mean, I don't think it necessarily means it's a brachiosaurus.
Thank you, Jackson. Kent, question was for you. You get the last word.
Yeah, I don't work for AIG. Probably a good thing. They'd fire me, but I do believe that ichthyostones are legitimate. And I think, but again, it's irrelevant to the discussion. The Bible says clearly, God made everything in 6 days. If dinosaurs lived before man, millions of years before man, then clearly that's calling the Bible a lie. And Jesus said the creation of Adam was the beginning. So they're calling Jesus a liar. So you can't have both. You can't say, oh, I believe the Bible and I believe dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. The dinosaurs lived with man. They just called them different names. The word dinosaur wasn't made up till 1841 in Richard Owen, meaning terrible lizard, terrible reptile.
All right. Thank you, Kent. Matt, go ahead. Pick the next question.
Super chat for you, Standing for Truth. Can you bring on Dr. Stephen Meyer?
Stephen Meyer, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. We'll reach out. That'd be a ton of fun. Go ahead.
Another one for you. Does Matt Powell have any upcoming debates?
We are working on a couple. Nothing official yet. So I recommend his debate with Dr. Kenny Rhodes, which I think was about a month ago, if anyone's interested.
Okay. Another question, I guess it'll be for both of you, but it's directed at Jackson. Are you willing to admit that you put your faith strictly in evolutionary professors and reject those PhDs who disagree with them in favor of young Earth creation?
Well, there are very few PhDs who disagree with them, but I mean, yeah, I don't really put faith in anyone. I look at the evidence myself, and it looks legitimate. I'll say it looks legitimate. If it doesn't, I'll admit it and say this looks kind of silly. So that's basically my answer to that. I'm not following people like they're priests or something. So.
Okay. And that would be really hard for Kent to answer. So I think I should go on to the next one.
Well, no, I got one comment on that.
Okay.
The nation of China has about 4 times as many people as we do. Okay, it's huge. And they teach communism in their school system exclusively. Communism is good. That's the only system they teach. I think all of the doctors and PhDs and even postdoctoral students and professors in China would teach communism's good. Therefore, does that make communism good because the majority believe it, or because all the peer-reviewed articles in China glorify communism and say capitalism is bad? The fact that many PhDs in America accept evolution is immaterial, doesn't matter. The fact that all the PhDs in Muslim countries teach Islam is wonderful, that doesn't make it true. It just proves they got control of the system, that's all. So the fact that the atheists and evolutionists have current control of our education system doesn't make it true, just means they got majority opinion, that's all.
Okay. Another super chat then. This one was from a person who challenged you to a debate, Kent. This is why are you interrupting Jackson? Your debates are supposed to be on one topic at a time without interruptions. Are you violating your own rules?
Well, I'm going to jump in there real quick. I don't think there was any interruptions. Let's be careful to not ask. It seemed, because we have such a big audience, there's a lot of questions that'll come in that are just not relevant to it. I thought the discussion went cordial. Of course, Kent, if he's coming at you, feel free to respond. But Matt, let's make sure we get to questions that are kind of related to the topic, the most important ones.
These were timed. This isn't a timed back and forth. This is a debate. I just thought that was funny. He's angry. But okay, next.
Well, go ahead. Let Kent respond if he wants. But yeah, let's do our best to get to the important questions.
Well, I think the one that asked the question is scratching the bottom of the barrel. They're desperate to find something to pin on me because they certainly can't argue with the logic. Dogs produce dogs, without exception. Fossils don't count at all. You can't argue with that. So let's say he interrupted. Okay, well, move on.
It sounds like he's just triggered or angry for
exactly right.
Okay, Matt, let's choose a good question pertaining to the topic. I know we got 100 there, so
yeah, we got a lot more. Stacy Flores, another super chat. They didn't say who this was for, but I believe it was for Jackson. Since evolution is always seemingly improving organisms, like their chart shows, what are humans going to evolve into? Are we improving, and what is the evidence?
It's not necessarily improving, but yeah, it's just descent with modification. We are still evolving. I mean, anything that continues to have offspring is going to evolve. But what we're evolving into is, impossible to say. I mean, you really can't look into the future,
Right. Ken, do you have anything to say on that one?
I think that's ludicrous what he said, and anything with offspring is going to evolve. This shows his incredible faith and his brainwashing program that he swallowed hook, line, and sinker. Nothing that produces offspring is going to evolve. Grass produces grass, cows produce cows, dogs produce dogs. It doesn't happen, Jackson. You're dreaming. Sorry, they brainwashed you.
All right. Now we're going to drop into no more super chats. Now we just have a whole list to go through. Jackson, you got a ton. So we're going to go back and forth for a little while, and then I just run out of questions for Kent, and Jackson, you've got the floor after that. So first one for Jackson from Fred Smith. Considering all the necessary parts for a living cell to exist at the same time, how did evolution ever get its start?
Well, cells used to be much more simple, like cyanobacteria. They're much more simple than, say, E. coli bacteria. And the fossil record shows organisms like cyanobacteria were first. Yeah, a cell is complex, but the organelles, for example, mitochondria and chloroplasts, evidently were not always part of our cells. They formed a symbiotic relationship with our cells hundreds of millions of years ago to form what our cells are today. So, I mean, you can laugh at that, but that's what the evidence shows. So that's really all I have to say.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, Ken.
A single cell is more complicated than the space shuttle. There is no such thing as a simple life form. If it's alive, it's complicated. If it's able to reproduce, it's really complicated. So this is what he demonstrated was clearly a religious belief that he holds to and an example of the brainwashing he succumbed to. And there is no such thing as a simple life form. There is no evidence of any single cell, multi-cell, plant, animal, anything ever producing other than its kind. Exactly what God said would happen.
All right.
Jackson, that was your question. You get the last word. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's a little borderline ad hominem to say I'm brainwashed or I'm, something like along those lines. I think it's gone a little bit too far, but whatever. I mean, yeah, that's really all I have to say.
Okay. Question for Kent. Why can't God create creatures that evolve?
Oh, I'm sure he could. He didn't, though.
Good one. All right. Jackson, anything to comment?
Not really. It's kind of a funny comment.
Yeah, that was a good one. All right. Question for you then, Jackson. Can mitochondrial Eve be traced to apes?
Well, considering we're still an ape. Yes, I guess is my answer.
Okay. Kent?
I mean, similar short answer.
Well, for him to say we are still an ape, I guess he can speak for himself. I am not, never have been. I'm human.
All right. Question for, who was that one for? Okay, that was for Jackson. So Dr. Dino, question for Dr. Dino by Saved by Grace. Kind of off the topic of human evolution, but it says gas giants, planets like Jupiter and Saturn, radiate more energy than the planets receive from the sun. Is this powerful evidence for a recent origin?
There are thousands of lines of evidence that would lead us to believe the universe cannot possibly be billions of years old. If I told you this ink pen was 4,000 years old, I think you could quickly prove I was wrong because the ballpoint mechanism wasn't developed until 50 years ago. Oh, good idea. Okay. I think you could quickly prove my 4,000-year age for this ink pen is wrong. I think I could quickly prove the age of the Earth that they're claiming, 4.6 billion years, is wrong. The gas giants that are radiating heat. Pluto still has warm. I mean, that's way out there, 39 astronomical units away, if you want to call it a planet. I still do. The moon is getting further from the Earth. The sun is burning up its fuel. It's burning up 5 million tons a second. You just can't keep doing that forever. You're going to burn up your fuel source. So I cover on my video number 1 quite a few different scientific ways to show this universe cannot possibly be billions of years old. They might need billions of years for them to believe their theory. Okay. You can't have it. It's not available. The gas giants, the guy people are talking about, is one of hundreds of examples that this universe cannot be billions of years old. Can't be.
Okay. Jackson, you want to counter that?
Yeah. As for the gas giants, they're not taking into account radioactive decay in the core and the pressure and the heat they're retaining. So, and for Pluto is tidally locked with its moon Charon, and they kind of basically circle each other. Charon is so large, and that produces a large amount of tidal heating. So that's why Pluto still has some heat to it. And the sun still has a couple billion years of life before it starts running out of hydrogen and starts expanding. So that's all I have to say.
Well,
go ahead.
My
final word.
Quick response. were these gas giants, including all the other planets, including all the stars, were they all in a dot smaller than a period on a page? That's what evolution teaches.
That's not what evolution teaches. That's more cosmology. But no, that's not.
Okay.
Hydrogen was the first element to come about. So to say Jupiter was in that dot, it doesn't really make any sense. It was really just energy at first. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree. It doesn't make any sense. But do you believe Jupiter was in that dot that rapidly expanded?
I believe the energy that would someday make Jupiter was in that dot.
So that little dot, smaller than a proton, contained all the matter and all the energy to make Jupiter. Is that your position?
It contained more energy than matter at that point. Matter kind of came about, hydrogen first, then helium, then produced stars, and those formed the heavier elements. That's what is actually taught.
I know that's what's taught. I'm saying that's dumb. But go ahead.
All right.
Well, it's not what you said it was taught.
I appreciate the back and forth. Matt, a couple super chats just came in, so let me put it up on screen, brother.
Sure.
And then we'll get to the next question. So this one comes in from Stacy Flores. I appreciate it. $5 super chat. Questions for you, Jackson. So Stacy says, Jackson, what do you think about evolution and survival of the fittest? And how does this apply to humans? Would this be an invitation to eugenics? Survival of the fittest, that is. Go ahead, Jackson.
Well, the term survival of the fittest wasn't really even coined by anyone of significance in the evolutionary theory, but it kind of caught on anyway. But it just means an animal adapted to its environment. It doesn't mean better than the other animals. It means, or is one human's better than another human because it has some feature. So no, I don't think it's has anything to do with eugenics.
All right, I appreciate that, Jackson. Dr. Hovind, if you wanted to add anything to that or make any points, go ahead.
Real quickly, in my video number 5 called The Dangers of Evolution, this is exactly what I teach, and I believe that evolution theory does indeed lead straight to eugenics. The Dangers of Evolution, that's the one they put me in prison 9 years for making that DVD. So yes, if the survival of the fittest is true, well, then those that are less fit deserve to die. And that leads straight to Adolf Hitler. You just decide who's the strongest and best, and let's kill the rest of them. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian and German are the best, according to Hitler. So everybody else ought to die. Yes, evolution is the foundation philosophy behind communism, socialism, Marxism, eugenics, abortion, lots of what I would call serious evils in this world. It's a philosophy that underlies all of those. It's evil. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kent. Jackson, super chat was for you. You can have a quick final word, and then we'll throw it back to Matt. Matt, you can ask the next question.
Well, Hitler says many times he gives credit to God, and then so I could just easily say he did it because of God, but that would be dishonest. I don't think that at all. But that's really all I have to say.
All right. We have a question now for who started that? Was that question for Jackson, you said?
Yes.
Okay, so this one will be from Call Me Emo for Kent. If fossils can't be used to show how organisms have changed, why do you use fossils to show how organisms were, for an example, larger in the past? That one was for Kent. So I can reword it if you like.
They're saying that was for me?
Yes. Yeah.
Fossils can't be used to prove anything other than something died. I think the very existence of fossils is evidence of a flood. How many animals died today in the world? Millions. How many are going to fossilize? None. Fossilization requires very special conditions, rapid burial, and oftentimes fossils are found completely articulated. All the bones are still in position. I mean, when an animal dies today, the buzzards and the coyotes and the ants haul it all over the place. You don't find it all fully assembled. So the existence of fully articulated fossil skeletons is a clear indication rapid burial, and the fossils are found by the billions. I think there was a flood, made nearly all of them. No fossils are forming today in any significant numbers, if at all. So yeah, fossils are great evidence of the flood, not for evolution.
All right, let me get to this next question, actually, that came in from Sam Jenkins. Sam, I appreciate it. Sam's associated with the creation research team of John Mackay, the creation guy, and Joseph Hubbard. So I appreciate your support and question, Sam. So this question's for you, Jackson. He asked, what is your answer to the fact that real human footprints, in brackets he puts, proved using imaging analysis, have been found in Cretaceous limestone? And just make sure you unmute yourself, Jackson.
All right. I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I would doubt that seriously if they've been found in Cretaceous limestone. But so I'm not sure what he's referring to, so I can't really speak much on that. Other than to say I doubt it.
Kent, did you want to add anything?
Well, I think there's no such thing as Cretaceous limestone. I think human footprints are found in multiple layers all over the world, sometimes some really big ones. I mean, really big human footprints indicating what the Bible teaches. Man was living to be nearly 1,000 years old and probably was much bigger than we are today. Evolution theory has man starting off small like a chimpanzee and slowly getting bigger, better, stronger, smarter. Bible has man starting off with Adam and Eve, perfect, us getting worse and dumber and believing we came from a rock. So yeah, I think that there's no such thing as Cretaceous, and I think human footprints are found in multiple layers. If somebody chooses to call it Cretaceous, they can, but human footprints are found in limestone. That's because there was a flood. They were running all over trying to get away from the thing, and finally ended up couldn't swim long enough.
All right, I appreciate that, Kent. Jackson, question was for you. Go ahead, final word.
Well, I think if they've been made in a flood, wouldn't the flood have just washed the footprints away immediately? I mean, to make these kind of footprints in the limestone, you need soft ground. You need to make the footprint. It needs to dry out. So I don't see how a flood like that could have produced it.
Matt, I just put the next question. We're going to start winding it down with the last couple questions. We are coming up at the hour and 45-minute mark. Great questions from the audience. This has been a ton of fun. I appreciate the super stickers, super chats flying in. Matt, go ahead.
Okay. Question for Jackson from Redefined Living. What is the empirical methodology for establishing ancestral relations with mineralized fossils in the geologic column?
Well, it's pretty complicated. You can't just say, and they've reclassified things many times in human evolution because it's not always clear what's leading to what. I was reading something today. They've grouped a couple of species into the same species. I forget what they called it, but yeah, it's a tangled web. And I'm not going to sit here and say it's very clear, but it is apparent that it did happen.
Ken, did you want to say anything on that one?
No comment.
Okay. Since most of the questions are going to be for Jackson, I'm sorry, can't no more popped in for you, but you can still answer. So this one came from Hugh Gadam. Question for does Jackson think that Aboriginal Australians are closer to apes?
No, I don't. That's just a racist idea that people had in the early 20th century, mid 20th century. And no, that's not what anyone thinks today. If you're not a total racist, anyway.
Okay. Kent?
I think historically it's quite obvious that the evolutionists did use that theory to say the Aborigines were inferior and killed off thousands of them. Yes, well, it's not true. They're not inferior, but that's what the theory of evolution leads to. Eugenics, to mass murder. It's a philosophy that motivated Hitler and Stalin and all these, yes, it's an evil theory. It's a philosophy that only the strongest have a right to survive.
All right. SFT, did you want to just
Sure.
pick a question? Or?
Yeah, we'll wind it down with this last question. So we've got a ton of questions to choose from, guys. I want to thank you again for tagging us and sending in your questions. This has been a great debate, but we got to end it somewhere. And I want to respect Kent and Jackson's time. Great endurance from the both of you. So here is the final question that we will get to. This one comes in from Den Tietjen. Hope I said that right. Question for Jackson. Jackson, Den asks you, how can scrambling existing DNA information create a new biochemical pathway or nanomachines with many components in order to make evolution possible?
Well, again, it takes many small steps to make a big change. It's not all at once. So that's what I've been saying this whole debate. That's basically all I have to say. It's just many small steps.
All right, I appreciate the answer. Dr. Hovind, if you wanted to add anything or make any final points.
Yeah, I think once again, he demonstrated his faith in a religion that many small steps can do something that nobody's ever observed. Evolution is religion, it's not science. And I've been working hard all day and I'm tired and I've been drinking water for 2 hours. I'm ready to quit. Go potty.
All right, I appreciate it. Jackson, Kent, again, thanks you for your time. And Matt, thank you for being here to gather all of these questions, because I think I would have been lost moderating and gathering the questions too. So final words, final thoughts. Actually, Kent, we'll let you get going. And Jackson, again, thank you so much. Matt, thank you as well. Last thing I'll say before we shut it down, Logical, Plausible, Probable has an open mic after show that is going to take place as soon as this debate ends. Jackson, great debate. Tons of fun. We had like 100. I think we had about 320 people at one point. Human evolution, man. That's one of my favorite topics for sure. Jackson and I debated that several months ago, actually. Human evolution.
I couldn't pick out a winner from that. I think we both kind of countered each other pretty well.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed that debate. I think we got deep into a lot of the so-called hominids and transitionals. But that's my question to you, Jackson, is how do you feel about, and you may even disagree with this, actually. That's why I don't mind pushback. But I find after examining all the best so-called examples of ape-to-man evolution, so-called basal forms of humans or primitive forms, as they'll call it, right? They'll look at they'll pick up the most anomalous bone in the fossil record and they'll say, see, this is basal because there's some anomalies when you compare it to extant humans. But from my investigation into this, I've been able to, I believe, sufficiently categorize every so-called transition or example of a basal human as either fully human, degenerated human, fully ape, degenerated ape, or amazingly an artificial species. Like I've got a couple articles in front of me, including a couple papers that talk about how Australopithecus sediba and Homo habilis may indeed be the result of the accidental mixture of ape and human bones, right? So that's what I mean by artificial species, is in that which is called Australopithecus sediba isn't actually a real species. It's a mixture. What are your thoughts on that, Jackson?
Well, there are two good specimens of Australopithecus sediba, so I think it's pretty unlikely that they're artificial species. And habilis might be, and Rudolfensis might be the same species, or they might be an Australopithecus. It really doesn't matter what you call it at that point. But yeah.
Actually, John, if you could share my screen. Can you see my screen, guys?
No, born 100 years late. I only have like 3.
John,
There's only 3 of them.
Oh, you can see my. Okay.
Yeah, your screen.
Okay.
But the thing about sediba is they're not really thought to be our direct ancestor. They're more of an offshoot.
Right.
They're the
Right.
timeline and the some of the features doesn't really match with what we would expect from a true human ancestor.
Well, from my experience debating, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. From my experience debating some pretty militant evolutionists, they'll look to Sadiba and habilis. For example, Gutsick Gibbon, she's got a video titled something similar to, the perfect transitionals, something like that, or a creationist's worst nightmare. And the two she picked out are Australopithecus sediba and Homo habilis. But what's funny is,
I wouldn't have picked Sadiba.
Yeah. And those are the two most disputed. Like, for example, even if it wasn't an artificial species, as you pointed out, just in 2018, 2019, there's many paleoanthropologists pointing out that Australopithecus sediba has been ousted as a direct ancestor to the Homo genus, right?
It's more.
But then there's also those right here that I was pointing out. Just to demonstrate what I was saying is true. Human missing link species may be jumble of species. And Ella Bin and Yoel Rack, they've pointed out that Australopithecus sediba is a mixture of Homo and also apes. And also, and last thing I'll say too, and I'll get your thoughts, Jackson, famous paleoanthropologist Lee Berger, he's actually recently admitted that Australopithecus afarensis, right, Lucy, the famous Lucy species, is a chimeric species. It's the mixture of human and ape bones as well. So Lucy, being one of the most favorite so-called examples of human evolution over the years, is now even being looked at as a possible chimeric species. So my point is, it doesn't really seem like there's any really strong examples, when if human evolution is true, I feel like there should just be so many examples that it's just undeniable, it's overwhelming, and I just don't think that we really see that. Yeah, go ahead. What are your thoughts, Jackson?
Well, there are a couple other specimens of afarensis and Lucy, like the big man and the Salem child, that are partially complete skeletons, and they're like hundreds of other incomplete just fragments. So I don't think it's a chimeric species, but there's one almost fully complete specimen of Australopithecus prometheus, or which might be an early Africanus, that shows that it was trapped in limestone, Sturgeon cave. So we know that all the bones belong to the same individual conclusively. And it's not on our direct lineage, most likely, but it's still an offshoot showing the progression,
Right. But that seems to be my biggest problem, is the best so-called examples of a true transition from ape to man, Australopithecine-like ancestors up to Homo habilis, up to Homo erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens. They always consist of such a scattered bone collection, right? Lucy here was originally found in hundreds of pieces, and that's how you can even get chimeric species in the first place, is because, like, for example, when you hear, because you keep saying, they got this many specimens, and when you hear defenders of evolution say, we've got 400 specimens of Lucy, people think, oh wow, they got 400 full complete skeletons. Right. So, for example, this is an example of what they mean by 400 specimens. It's 400 fragments here. Everybody on the panel can see. So they turn this into that. I mean, it's amazing. From these fragments, they know what Lucy looked like and what Lucy's husband and child looked like.
a lot of assumptions went into putting that together, I think, just like the geologic column theory. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad to try to guess things, but whenever you put things together just the way that you think they fit, and they just happen to almost fit that way, it doesn't really prove anything. It's a theory, don't get me wrong, but it hasn't been observed. I mean, it hasn't gone through a scientific.
I wouldn't even call it a good theory.
It's a hypothesis at best.
Well,
Right.
they'll say it's a theory, but something way, way before a theory is a hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, a theory at least has to be tested once, correct? I mean, you kind of hypothesize about it, then you test, observe, repeat, and form a theory as you go, kind of thing.
For example, if I had a theory, I had an idea that a cow, we know cows can jump. So, I mean, if you feed it enough, train it enough, eventually it'll be able to jump over the moon. we know there's no evidence for that. There's nothing supporting it. So it's always just going to stay as a hypothesis. And that's exactly what we see with human evolution. They have an idea, but it's not supported by the data, which means it's just going to remain a poor hypothesis. And I'd be curious as to Jackson's thoughts here too, because they'll try and say, well, you've got your Australopithecines, 6 to 8 million years ago. And then, eventually you got Homo habilis, which they'll say is a perfect transition of Australopithecus-like ancestors to the Homo genus. But what we actually see is extensive coexistence of even the earliest Australopithecines and man. And I have a list of examples as to how we know they coexisted. And we find human limb bones, human jaw bones, human hands, foot bones. We find human footprints, human bones, shelters, stone tools, butchered bones, showing that it's humans, obviously the ones doing this butchering, and also humans being buried with Australopithecines. And last thing I'll say, examples of humans eating robust Australopithecines. So my point is, we see such overlap, which is actually what we would expect after the flood and post-Babel or even pre-Babel, is we would see a lot of this coexistence, right? What are your thoughts on that significant coexistence we see, Jackson?
Well, nothing I've read has suggested that humans in their modern forms survived alongside Australopithecines, but maybe Homo habilis or some other early Homo species did. I know Australopithecus anamensis and Australopithecus afarensis inhabited the same area at the same time, but it's inferred that anamensis may be its ancestor. But maybe one population diverged and became afarensis, and one population kind of remained fairly similar in anamensis. Might be one explanation for that, but I'm not familiar with humans living alongside Australopithecines.
Yeah, you find example after example of it. For example, here's a quote from famous paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey. "I see no reason that bands of Homo would not have killed and eaten robust Australopithecines when they could, just as they killed and ate antelopes and other prey animals." There's also a quote from
I know what you're talking about now. The robust Australopithecines, like Paranthropus, they did live alongside like Homo habilis.
Right. But remember, if people like even Lee Berger are admitting that, well, Australopithecus afarensis may be a chimeric species, mixture of Homo and 8 bones. Well, that means by definition, humans must have lived alongside or coexisted with the Australopithecine. Now, I know what you're saying is, well, maybe it's a basal form of humans, right? You're saying, well, maybe it's erectus. But that's the point, is the data that we find pertaining to, so-called early humans. I'm trying to pull up the paper here on Homo erectus. I can't find the paper, but I do have an example here that Homo erectus has evidence for purposeful navigation, has evidence for being able to speak, but Homo erectus also has evidence for what's called reductive evolution. And that's where you have these subpopulations isolating themselves, and what results is inbreeding and accelerated genetic degeneration. So they'll pull up these anomalous features, these anomalous bones, and they'll say, see, this is basal to extant humans today. When in fact, no, what we're looking at is something that's fully human, but it's riddled with pathology, it's riddled with disease, it's riddled with degeneration. So where they're saying is, this is basal, this is primitive, it's actually just an example of a fully human people group experiencing reductive evolution, which isn't evidence for obviously ape to man evolution. Yeah, go ahead, Jackson.
Well, we don't have DNA for Erectus, but we do for Neanderthals, which aren't our ancestors, they're more our cousins. But we differ by 202 base pairs in the mitochondrial DNA, which indicates they are a different species. So I don't think there's a degenerated human or a different human.
If my screen's still shared, you can see the drastic difference in understanding pertaining to Neanderthalensis. 1856, they articulated and represented him as this brutish half ape, half man. But today, for example, in 2015, the reconstructions have drastically changed. And this is based on the fact that now we know that Neanderthals buried their dead, made musical instruments, tools, cosmetics, jewelry, and purses. Their DNA shows that they were human and interbred with us. I mean, we literally have their genetics. And the reason why they are different in terms of their genetics, as in there's a slight divergence, right? Even though they're still 99.7% similar to us, right? Every human today is 99.999% similar. Neanderthals, which are an extinct people group, they're 99.7% similar. Well, we'd expect their genetics to be slightly divergent because they were the most inbred people group on the planet, actually. And they accumulated a lot of recessive mutations came to the forefront because they existed in small tribes. Therefore, they were highly inbred. And what would result is rapid fixation of new genetic variants. So that explains why they're slightly different in their genetics. But we actually have paleoanthropologists that will admit Homo neanderthalensis should be considered a subspecies of Homo sapiens rather than a separate species. I think the only people that want to say Neanderthals are a sister species or a separate species are those that are so committed to the ape to man evolution story that they'll say, well, sure, according to the modern definition of species, then yes, they would be the same species. But, assumption after assumption pertaining to human evolution, they can't actually be a descendant of Homo sapiens, so therefore they'll put them as a sister species. But the actual genetic data and also the fossil data would just suggest that they're a variant of human, but they are degenerated due to inbreeding. Yeah, go ahead, Jackson.
Well, if they were degenerated due to inbreeding, and all humans started out with two individuals, why aren't we all the same amount of inbred?
That's a good question, actually. That would be because, and I think you and I discussed this in our debates as to what the fundamental difference is between our model and your model when it comes to the origin of genetic diversity. For example, how do you explain, from an evolutionary starting point, the origin of most or all genetic variation?
Well, I don't know. I'm honestly don't have a good explanation for it. I know other people do. I'm just not the best representative for some of this subject matter.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not referring to like the origin of the first life or the first cell. I'm talking about the DNA variety, the DNA differences that exist within species and across species. I'm just talking about how I'm really hearing some feedback. So I don't know. Hopefully whoever's not talking, just mute. I don't think it's you though, Jackson. So for example, here, if my screen's still shared, it says the ultimate source of all genetic variation is mutation, right? The evolutionary model, they'll say that mutations add genetic diversity, right? Because mutations are adding something that was not previously there. So the evolutionary model looks to mutations as being the source for all genetic variation. And eventually you have processes like recombination, which can scramble up that genetic variation, those DNA differences, creating new varieties and new species. But our model as a creationist, we look to created nuclear heterozygosity. So what that, it sounds fancy, but all it means is the original created types or kinds, they would have been front loaded with genetic variation. So you look to mutations as being the ultimate source. We actually look to most genetic variation as being not by mutation, but by being the result of design, initial front loading at creation. So that means Adam and Eve would have had no mutations. They would have had no genetic mistakes, no genetic defects at creation. And therefore, there wouldn't have been an inbreeding problem. Yes, there would have had to have been inbreeding the first couple generations, but there'd be no mutations those first few generations to actually come to the forefront and lead to genetic damage. But the evolutionary model, there's a problem for you, Jackson, because you explain genetic variation as being the result of mutation. So yeah, you actually have an inbreeding problem when it comes to the out of Africa population bottleneck, for example, because you have all of these mutations in hidden recessive form that are going to come to the forefront and be manifested, leading to accelerated genetic damage. So that's how we don't have a mutation problem or an inbreeding problem, just to answer your question. Yeah, go ahead, Jackson.
Well, even if Adam and Eve had a perfect genome, their offspring wouldn't. They would be damaged by the sun's rays, or genetic code would be damaged to some extent somehow. But even if it wasn't, you have long after the fall, you have Noah's Ark, which is another severe genetic bottleneck where there are only 3 pairs. So we're back to the same problem of why aren't all humans the same amount of inbred?
Well, it's not a problem because when you
Ask the royal family.
ask the royal family. So you'd have Adam and Eve who would immediately start having kids, and then their kids would start having kids, and so on and so forth. Adam and Eve would have had dozens and dozens of kids. Now, what we see in terms of the biblical bottlenecks, we can actually reflect them on phylogenetic trees, is we see that's why you see this starburst pattern, right? Where you have explosive growth from a center point. We can see this in the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. Okay, Y chromosome is inherited from our father, mitochondrial DNA from our mother. So the point I'm trying to make is the biblical bottlenecks, they were short. They were 1 or 2 generations max, and they were followed by rapid and exponential population growth. So what that actually means by definition when it comes to bottlenecks is very limited genetic diversity would be lost. And since at creation, you'd have no genetic mutations to come to the forefront, you wouldn't have any genetic damage. And at the flood, you would have, 1 generation followed by rapid and exponential population growth. You wouldn't have the type of mutation accumulation that we see today. But the problem is, Jackson, I'd be curious as to how you answer this. Actually, I should set it up first by asking you, since today all humans are 99.99% similar, right? That means humans have low genetic diversity. This was contradictory to what the evolutionary community expected, right? Because if you're evolving from the Australopithecines up to Homo habilis, up to Erectus, and supposedly Erectus lived on the globe for millions of years, and then eventually Homo sapiens, well, every generation you have new mutations pouring into the next generation. That would be adding diversity. So we today should have high diversity, but how can we have low diversity, would you say, Jackson?
Well, I know some African populations have an incredible amount of diversity. I know that people outside of Africa have a lower amount, and I think that fits with the model of starting in Africa and going elsewhere. But what was I going to say?
But remember,
diversity. Yeah.
Well, remember, when you look at Africans and non-Africans, right? Africans and non-Africans are still human. So overall, whether you look at an African or a non-African, there's still low genetic diversity. I mean, and this goes for the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments as well, like the mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome. For example, in the mitochondrial DNA, the average amount of differences between any two people is about 20 to 25. Now, the most is about 120, maybe 125. That would be between like me and an African. So yes, Africans have more genetic diversity than non-Africans, but overall, humans in general, both Africans and non-Africans, still have low genetic diversity, especially compared to other species. So my question is, why isn't there a greater amount of genetic diversity if deep time evolution is true?
Well, there was a genetic bottleneck 50 to 100,000 years ago, of where the human population got down to a few thousand individuals, they think, based on genetics. And there are animals with lower genetic diversity than we have, and you would think it would be uniform across all species because of the arc. But like cheetahs, they got down to just a few individuals, and they're having all kinds of problems now. Same with Tasmanian devils. I would ask, why aren't all animals suffering severe inbreeding consequences if they all went through a bottleneck at the arc?
Right. Those are good questions. Your first answer was correct. So let me address that. Before I do, I just wanted to point out the source, and then I'm going to stop screen sharing for now. Because in the debate, it was brought up by, I think, Sam Jenkins, that we found human footprints in layers that are millions of years old, that we probably shouldn't find them. Here's two examples: the Lyell footprints, which I'm sure you're aware of, and then more recently, footprints in Crete that were dated to 5.7 million years old. And those that discovered and have examined these footprints, they've admitted that, okay, if these were found today, let's say they were found on a beach today, they would be indistinguishable from human, as in the only conclusion you'd make is they're human. But because they're being found in millions of years worth of strata, then it's this circular reasoning going on. So now they're saying, well, you know, we know humans were not around back then, so therefore they can't be human, and therefore what are they, right? And
yeah, if these are human, this blows our whole thing apart, right? That's
right.
Kind of
exactly. So they can't conclude, well, these are human footprints, even though that's exactly what they like. Here's an example. Here's the Lyell footprints, right? Inline big toe.
Yeah.
You know, here's a chip. Here's a human foot. I mean, a modern human footprint perfectly overlaps the Lyell footprint. Now, they've done studies, and I've read the studies where they try. Yeah, go ahead.
It also overlaps with the afarensis foot. They found enough foot bones to basically say that the toe was in line with the other toes. As for the Crete footprints, they're not perfectly human. They're shaped a little bit differently. They're a little bit broader, a little bit shorter.
Actually, I've seen people with some inhuman feet before. I don't know.
Well, here's the thing about that, is when it comes to afarensis, what they actually have in terms of what they think is a foot bone, or an example of what their feet look like, is, okay, it's circular reasoning, is this footprint, okay, that they've just arbitrarily concluded belongs to afarensis, and small little fragments, which many paleoanthropologists have admitted those fragments don't even belong to afarensis. They're just a human. The reason why they look human, the fragments, is because they are human. And this is the paper I wanted to show you earlier. Donald Johansen, he points out, and he is the discoverer of Lucy. He pointed out that his collection suggested that Homo and Australopithecus coexisted as early as 3 million years ago. Now, granted, this Homo could be Homo erectus, but as I've demonstrated, Homo erectus is still fully human, still considered a human, just a degenerated human. Now, they've tried to say that the stride on the Lyell footprint is slightly divergent from humans today, which is just ridiculous. I mean, there's different strides today. If I'm striding through sand and I've got a limp or my knee's sore or something, I mean, there's so many variations in strides that to conclude that, well, this isn't human, this is, you know, a transitional form of human based on their stride or something like that, to me is rather weak. And Jackson, before you comment on that, because I feel free to do so, your question about the genetic diversity is correct. The evolutionists will say, well, we expected higher genetic diversity. We found that humans have low diversity. Therefore, there must have been some type of near extinction event roughly 70 to maybe 200,000 years ago, right? There's debate over it. And what would have happened was humans at that time would have been downsized or reduced to between 2 and 10,000. So what happens when you have a population of 2 to 10,000 for many, many, many years, maybe even thousands of years? Well, you have inbreeding, which then reduces levels of genetic diversity. But my problem with that whole model is, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Jackson. Okay, We as creationists, we explain the origin of genetic variation as being designed and created, right? But you guys, you explain the origin of genetic variation as being the result of mutations. So this hypothetical population bottleneck, it doesn't work, Jackson, because you have a population of 2 to 10,000 humans that are inbreeding for who knows how many years, thousands of years maybe. You'd have so many negative, deleterious, and disease-causing mutations coming to the forefront that so-called hypothetical bottleneck actually would have driven humans to extinction rather than a spreading out into all parts of the world where this so-called human population seized dominion over the planet, eventually inventing the space shuttle. You know, this inbreeding event would have been detrimental. I don't think it's realistic. Yeah, go ahead, Jackson. I said a lot there.
Well, biologists think the minimum population size for a viable population is 100 pairs. So 1,000 wouldn't have been the end of the world, but it would have reduced genetic diversity by a lot.
But remember, you've got 2 to 10,000, not for one generation, not for two generations, but you'd need hundreds, maybe thousands of generations in order to reduce all of that genetic diversity in the first place. Remember that the human population before the bottleneck would have had high diversity. So now the evolutionary community invokes the bottleneck. So it reduces the human population at that time to say between 2 and 10,000. Now they require, and they never give a number because they don't know, but let's say thousands of years worth of inbreeding in order to reduce the levels of diversity. I mean, that population would have been so genetically damaged. It's not just 1 or 2 generations. That's the problem. We see an example of this today, Jackson, as you pointed out, with the cheetahs. Cheetahs are experiencing a genetic bottleneck. They're down to 7,000. Their sperm is degenerate. They're highly degenerate. Conservationists are worried about them. And we're obviously not going to expect this population of 7,000 cheetahs to suddenly spread out into all parts of the world, seizing dominion over the planet. Right? They're highly and that's an example of what that population of humans would have been like. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the population, they think, was at one point down to a few individuals, and that's the problem. It's not that it's 7,000 today. It's that it was even lower in the past through probably natural processes, and they just barely survived.
What would have brought the cheetahs down to 3 individuals?
A few individuals. It could have been disease, could have been the ice age, and their habitat nearly got wiped out. No one knows.
It's more so hypothetical, but you're asking about the genetic diversity levels in all animals. Why don't they reflect a flood bottleneck? The thing is, they do.
Yeah.
Because we have, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the newer Rockefeller study on genetic boundaries and the CO1 gene, the barcoding gene. It's in the mitochondria. It's a highly conserved mitochondrial gene called the CO1 gene. It's highly conserved, and there's low genetic diversity in all species. You've probably heard the headline over and over again, Jackson, or maybe anybody on the panel. There's been many articles written on it where it talks about how over 90% of today's species arose or originated at exactly the same time. That's based on this genetic boundary study. So yeah, that makes sense to us because we had a flood bottleneck 4,500 years ago where you have all these archetypes coming out, spreading into all parts of the world. So the diversity levels we see in these highly conserved genes within animal species, they do reflect the flood bottleneck. Yeah, go ahead, Jackson.
Well, I know the paper you're talking about. I don't remember all the details of it, but I remember that it got misinterpreted by one news outlet, and people ran with that. I don't remember all the details.
Well, they said it was misinterpreted because what they did is they took the genetic data and they calibrated it with their assumed deep time evolutionary history, right? So they said, well, the young Earth creationists are misrepresenting this data because, the authors of this paper are saying that the origin of these species goes back 200,000 years ago. But the thing is, when you actually read the paper, they're not basing that off the genetic data. They're basing that off of circular reasoning and calibration. When we only go by the genetic data, we can safely say that this bottleneck, where 90% of today's species arose at the same time, was actually indeed 4,500 years ago. But you have to read through the lines. You have to read through the evolutionary based assumptions in the paper to come to that conclusion. You have to realize, okay, the date they're getting of 200,000 years, that's not based on genetics. That's actually based on the geological column. So to me, that's not misrepresenting the paper. That's just reading the paper in an unbiased way, where we're not just assuming the conclusions and assuming the evolutionary assumptions. We're looking at the empirical data, and then we're making our conclusions. Go ahead, Jackson.
Well, I haven't read the paper, so I can't really argue against it. So
no, that's fine. I just wanted to answer your question as to why we
Yeah.
don't see genetic diversity levels representing or being reflective of a flood bottleneck 4,500 years ago. And my point is we do, because we actually see low diversity in humans, which is what we would expect. God created two people, Adam and Eve, 6,000 years ago. That would reduce genetic diversity right off the bat. We know God created populations of animals, so we'd expect a greater diversity within animal populations. That's exactly what we see today. And because of the flood bottleneck 4,500 years ago, we would expect a lot of these highly conserved genes to be reflective of that. And that's also what we find is low diversity in animal populations within the mitochondrial DNA barcoding genes. So, I mean, to me, it's really just fascinating how well the scientific data corroborates the biblical count of origins. I haven't seen theistic evolutionists deal with it. I haven't seen old earth creationists deal with it. And I certainly haven't seen atheists deal with it. But I've been talking a lot, so I yield.
Well, my point is the genetic diversity seems to be variable between species. Like Tuatara seems to have a good amount of genetic diversity from what I've read, or maybe not. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. But the cheetah doesn't. Tasmanian devil doesn't. So you would think they would be all identical if they all originated from two animals on the ark.
Well, we wouldn't expect them to all be identical because you have different generation times, different reproductive rates. We have some animal kinds that were brought in sevens as compared to in twos, depending on clean versus unclean. Larger mammals like elephants are not going to reproduce as quickly as smaller mammals like mice. But overall, the rule is we see greater diversity in animals than we see in humans. Of course, there's always going to be an exception to the rule, but the exception to the rule doesn't overturn the rule. And the example of cheetahs, of course, after the flood, you would have had a couple cheetahs, maybe. No, you wouldn't have cheetahs. You would have had the cheetah archetype, right? You would have had some cat archetype on board the ark, possibly Polarius, if you want to look that up. I think something similar to that, which would have given rise simply through the shuffling of these front-loaded genetic differences, simply through recombination and gene conversion. You get from one cat archetype off the ark into what we see today: house cats, lions, jaguars, cheetahs. So eventually you would have had a breakaway population. That population would have changed enough where you can consider it a new species. You could say, okay, this is a cheetah, but that cheetah would have faced a different historical and environmental history than the other felids. And therefore the cheetahs might have went into a bottleneck. It's not like a one size rule fits all, right? So yeah, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I don't really have anything to argue with. I mean, I'm going to go on to the next thing or whatever about human evolution.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's, I think that was a great back and forth. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I'm wondering how many specimens they have together. I was trying to look it up earlier of, these different types of homos or whatever, Homo erectus, Homo habilis. I haven't seen, definitive proof that they've gotten more than like basically that little pile of bones you showed earlier. I was wondering how they determined that type of, diversity in the genes and that sort of thing. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on that earlier, but I never got around to it. I keep getting kid aggro, so I keep running off and like chasing children around. So.
I feel your pain, brother. No worries. Well, what's interesting is we don't have the genetics for. I always point out this fact.
Hey, SFT.
Yeah, go ahead.
SFT, real quick. So Born 100 years late, $5 super chat says, SFT, thank you, brother. In my life, I've heard only a few speak about the truth like you do. Jackson, I hope you consider what he is saying.
Well, I
Sure, I
appreciate
consider everything.
I appreciate the kind words. Born 100 years late. I find this topic of ancestry fascinating. So I've done my best to look at both sides, and I'm just not very convinced that the evolutionary side. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you want to explain this to Andrew for about the 50,000th time? He doesn't
I've got a whole
understand.
playlist of debates with Andrew just because he's still talking a big
He
game.
still doesn't understand heterozygosity and a front-loaded genome. He does not understand what that means. It's really amazing.
It's good practice, though, if you keep practicing doing it. And
yeah. I've only written several books on it, Andrew, and had complete debates on it. Created heterozygosity just means, in simple terms, a state of DNA diversity. Homozygosity means a state of no DNA diversity. So the original created kinds would have obviously been created in a state of DNA diversity. For example, the Bible says, be fruitful and multiply. Now, would God have wanted that to be carried out through cloning? Because if the original created kinds were created genetically homogeneous with no DNA diversity, that's exactly what would have occurred. Cloning. Okay, there's no DNA diversity built in. So for God to design organisms with the front-loaded capacity for change, for diversity, that makes more sense of God's command to be fruitful and multiply. That means the DNA differences we see for the most part between species within species, we would predict that since they're the result of initial design, they should be functional, beneficial, and useful. And these predictions have been in print for years and years and years. And as the years go on, John can speak to this, we find paper after paper of just that. DNA sequences, DNA elements that we once thought were non-functional evolutionary leftovers, they're actually showing and proving to be functional and highly beneficial to healthy life processes in the cell of all life. I mean, that's a fulfilled prediction right there. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, me.
Well, I don't know. I guess
it's
anybody
a
that wants to comment.
very good point. Very good point. So real quick, so ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Alexander is the first to subscribe to the new Twitch channel. So if anybody wants to head on over to Twitch and sub to the channel, feel free to do so. Link is in the side chat.
That a boy, Patrick.
But yeah, man, this whole conversation of like, I really don't grasp why so many Evo atheists have such a hard time grasping that premise in relation to how it would, in many instances, account for what they think is proof of evolution from a phylogenetic perspective. It's like, if you have divergence and deletion of, you had their pre-existing capacity, you go down a level, and you now don't necessarily have the previous version accessible, it's going to look like a hierarchy.
Exactly.
Like, this is not that complicated. And this is what I talk about in relation to like computer software all the freaking time, and nobody seems to grasp. Although last night or the night before, whenever it was, with Deepak, who was he's a machine learning artificial intelligence developer, he understood exactly what I was talking about when I was talking about something as simple as user permissions and the hierarchies that are created in that logic in basically every software application that exists. And developers understand this. Now, some of them who are the hardcore atheists don't want to accept that the same logic applies to genetics or could apply to genetics, but it doesn't mean that it's not real. And
right, like how would you explain like
apply.
Yeah, like how would you explain like symbiotic relationships and things like that? I didn't mean to cut you off, dude. My bad.
No, that's a great. Actually, John, a pull up Andrew Desperate Cummings worthless argument that we've demolished a million times there, where he says recombination does not lead. Okay, so recombination does not lead to this diversity when there are only two alleles at one loci. okay, which is a genetic location, and 2 individuals to start with. Can't happen. John, just out of curiosity, how many loci do you think exist in, let's say, the human genome?
Oh, no idea, but it's a lot.
A lot. Okay, so I'm going to teach Andrew here, who I've had several debates with, same with John, basic science. Okay, it goes back to this idea of just in basic genetics, big A, big B, little b. Okay, so the point is Adam and Eve would have been created with millions of DNA positions, where what they would have is allelic diversity. They'd have capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. Okay. You wouldn't just do this in 2 spots within the genome. I mean, you would have this kind of heterozygosity in millions of DNA positions that exist. Let me repeat that, Andrew. You'd have DNA heterozygosity in millions of DNA positions that exist. Okay. It's erroneous to say an allele is just, 2 or more genetic variants when you don't actually elaborate on the fact that this is DNA variety at a specific loci. Now, because you have millions of genetic locations in the genome, you then have pretty well an unlimited potential to produce all sorts of variety, even in a single generation. Think about Adam and Eve. They got millions of spots in their genome that are heterozygous, big A, big B, little b. In one generation of recombination where you scramble up those DNA differences, John, what are you going to get? You're going to get amazing variety, unbelievable variety. The evolutionists, they don't believe you can get variety quick because remember, they need millions and millions of years to build up this allelic diversity in the first place because they look to mutations, right? Well, if that allelic diversity is already built in from the start, then all it takes is 1 or 2 generations to produce variety. This goes back to my debate with Sloppy Saint a couple of weeks ago with John here on the channel. I mean, I must have tried to explain that to him 100 different ways. He just wouldn't get it because he kept trying to say, oh, no, you can't explain all the species today in a young Earth creation model. And I'm like, yeah, if you assume that the origin of all DNA varieties is mutations, of course not. You need millions of years to build up the variety. But if it's built in from the start, you get visible distinctiveness in 1 generation. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. It's just like and if everybody else wants to weigh in, feel free. But I mean, I just don't get why this premise seems so difficult to comprehend. I really wonder if Evo atheism prevents people from actually thinking and doing an analysis of anything that actually contradicts their standard talking points. And that's just
they can't.
The more I interact with people and observe the responses and like the apparent inability to grasp concepts, like what you're talking about, it's like they think, this contradicts evolution. I will not compute, cannot compute. They go into complete like system meltdown, red spiral, or spiral death. And
like Andrew right now, pull up his next comment where he says, you're not addressing what I said. Put it up. This guy who just is incapable of addressing. Yeah, right there. Okay. Andrew, again, listen, okay, because I know most of it goes over your head. And Andrew still hasn't been able to, for one, make better predictions than the young Earth creation model. 2, he's been incapable of addressing the phylogenetic data from the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. Okay, Andrew, as I've pointed out, when we start from the genomic position definition of an allele, okay, rather than your gene unit definition, I've even pointed this out to Joshua Stramidas, and I noticed in some of his later interviews, I think he's accepted correction without admitting it because I've noticed he's also been using the genomic position definition of an allele now as well. Okay, so let's put this into perspective. Let's take one single gene, right, John? Just one gene. Okay, well, we know that one single gene usually spans roughly thousands of nucleotides. Okay, and then you have these variants. Okay, these single nucleotide variants, you have them distributed throughout that gene. Okay, for example, let's say at 90 of the nucleotides within the gene, you have single nucleotide variants. Okay, well, that means every single one of those 90 variants, okay, that means they would have existed in a heterozygous state in each of the individuals of the pairs, let's say, brought on board the ark. And then obviously the creation event where you have more than just pairs. I mean, just from one single gene, you have a tremendous potential for allelic diversity. I mean, the question is, why don't we see even more variety today? You know,
and
this
the other thing,
argument's a
and
joke.
the other
Yeah, go ahead,
thing,
John.
something else that has to be addressed, and I know this will go right over Jackson's, or Jackson, sorry, Jackson, not you, Andrew's head, is the variability that is, we know beyond doubt is possible from the regulatory perspective. So the caterpillar to butterfly, right? We can take on an entirely different form, not just a kind of different form, an entirely different form can happen. The genome actually doesn't change. Regulation of it does. And in fact, lots of it like melt, like literally melt and disappear. Anyway, my point is that we know beyond doubt from observed evidence that from a regulatory expression variance of gene expression through variety of regulation can dramatically change things in real time. So to somehow argue that, oh, the gene is, the only thing that could have cause a change would be, allele variant, and somehow say that's the only thing that you have to account for in terms of potential variation of species and, like body plans, all that kind of stuff, is like, to me, it's a very, very small observation frame of reference in terms of like what is actually necessary from a big picture perspective. And I think because actually looking at it from a bigger perspective, the right now, so good grief, Andrew's continuing to be dumb. Do you want to address that, SFT? Or?
Yeah, he's misrepresenting because he's not getting it. Okay, let's take Adam and Eve, for example, okay? Just Adam and Eve at creation. So let's say they're created genetically heterozygous. Well, what does this mean? This means that they would be a mix of capital and what? And lowercase letters. Capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. Okay, that means they were probably something like a middle brown skin. Okay. And therefore, just from that mix of capital and lowercase letters all throughout the genome at millions of DNA positions, DNA spots within the genome, they have pretty well unlimited potential to produce every shade of skin that exists on this planet today. And this is the same for the animal kinds. Okay, you bring on a cat archetype, a dog archetype, a bear archetype, you name it. All of those front-loaded DNA differences, those front-loaded functional DNA differences can transcribe and explain all the different species we see today, all the different species of bears, all the different species of felids, canids. And a prediction of this model is DNA function. And we now have over 80% of the genome. We have evidence that over 80% of the genome is active. Now, we don't know what every DNA sequence does, and that's why we have PhD young Earth creationists like Nathaniel Jensen, for example, who is making very specific predictions, saying, okay, through mutagenesis, we're going to figure out that this is important to the genome, this DNA sequence, therefore it's going to lead to this disease, or, this gene here is not truly neutral, it's actually multifunctional, and therefore multifunctionality explains a lot of the hierarchical patterns, so on and so. I mean, you could read these papers, you can read these predictions, but these critics don't do so. It's just looking really bad for them at this point. John, did that make sense, brother?
Yeah, I mean, I totally follow what you're saying, but let's stop trying to.
Yeah. We've given enough time to Andrew, so we'll let other people jump in.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I was supposed to say he's just over here derailing. It looks like that's kind of funny.
Yeah, Slavic. You can come back in, brother. Sorry about he was waiting while we were ranting. I don't know, Jackson. I think you'd come off mute there for a second. Did you have something you wanted to insert?
No, not really. I'm not really into genetics that deep, so I'm not the one to argue that position. really.
Well, Jackson, let me ask you a question. What would be your favorite fossil specimen in terms of what you believe is a good example of like a transitional or a basal like human?
A human? Let me think. Probably my favorite fossil, not that it's the best ancestor, but my favorite fossil was the little folk specimen, the Australopithecus prometheus. It's the most complete.
Obviously, I have some comments to make on that, but I don't want to. Anyone else want to engage the fossil evidence with Jackson, because that's more a specialty. We'll kind of get off the genetics. I can engage him further, but I know we've been engaging quite a bit on this. So, anyone else have any thoughts or?
I actually I got a quick question. A lot of this stuff is way over my head, but I always wondered about how in the world did they know how far away we are from the genetics of like the super early humans? I mean, I'm assuming it's because they compare us to apes, just because, I mean, nobody has the genetic code of, really old humans, whatever they're called.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. I was going to point this out earlier, but I've often made the point that when we're trying to answer this important question of ancestry, I usually label it as separate ancestry or universal ancestry, right? Then we need to look to genetics. We need to look to traits, because that's what's inherited in sperm and egg. That's how we're going to answer the question of ancestry. But yeah, a lot of these bones found in the dirt, a lot of these fossil specimens, we don't actually have their genetics. So oftentimes there's a lot of inference being made simply based on morphology, simply based on a collection of bone fragments. And that's why the fossil record itself involves a lot of fancy storytelling. The story is oftentimes changing. That's why when we got the Neanderthal genetics, we quickly realized, wow, I mean, we interbred with them. We literally have their genetics. They're human, but we don't have the genetics of the Australopithecines. We don't have the genetics of most of these so-called examples of human evolution. So yeah, that's a good question. It's a lot of inference. Also looking to the chimpanzee genome, comparing chimpanzee genetics with human genetics, comparing human genetics with gorilla genetics, so on and so forth. But yeah, they don't have the genetics of most of these fossil specimens.
So would it be fair to say it's like completely guessing at, well, because we have similar genetics code to, let's say, an animal, well, then therefore we are related. It's literally just guessing because you have an assumption that we came from them. If we didn't have that assumption that we came from them, then you can just be like, like the Ford car. I heard this, I don't know where I heard this, but like they have different models. Does not mean that they're all evolving to a newer and better model. It's just that different, one designer designed a bunch of them. So if they don't hold to that dogmatic view that we're all evolving, well, at least, different ape, we were apes earlier and now we're a little bit more non-apes. If they didn't hold to that view, the genetic information wouldn't be pointing to that. Is that correct?
Exactly. I like the way Kent puts it, since it was Kent versus Jackson today. He says, just because the lug nuts of a Pontiac are interchangeable with that of a Chevy doesn't mean that they evolved from a skateboard millions of years ago, right? It demonstrates a common designer, just to put it simply. Jackson, I saw that you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say it's getting pretty late over here. Well, not over here, but just for me. So I'm probably going to head out. That's all right with you guys.
Of course. Yeah, Jackson, you've been busy tonight. You had a 2-hour debate and now a 2-hour after show. You're a champ, so I appreciate it. If you want, you can have some final thoughts, final words before you get out of here. But it's up to you.
No, I just thought it went good. I mean, I enjoyed it. Win or lose, I haven't decided if I won or lost yet. I'll have to watch it back. I'm probably going to do that here in a minute and go to bed.
Yeah, it's
And,
pretty late here as well. I got to go make sure everybody's still in their bed too. Dude, you did a great job, Jackson. I didn't mean to steal your. I'm gonna get off too.
No, you can. No, thanks. All right. Well, see you guys later.
Hey, blessings, Jackson. Great debate.
Yeah.
Dano as well. I was gonna say before he left, I liked his profile picture there. I thought that was funny. So Jackson, yeah, I'll shoot you an email sometime. And again, great debate, tons of fun.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun. All right, I'll see you guys later.
Appreciate it, Jackson. Have a good one, man. I just stepped away for a second. Appreciate you joining the after show.
So just to kind of double check here. So most of this genetic, the stuff they talk about, or the geneticists, at least the ones that are talking about evolution, they're literally making up stories because they have an assumption. It's not like it's hard science, even though they talk about it like it's hard science. Am I understanding this correctly?
Absolutely. Yeah, they don't. You'll be fascinated by this paper that I've been invoking in almost every debate for 3 years. Nobody ever addresses it. John, maybe share my screen just real quick. The genetic data where they build their stories doesn't even help them at all. Because for one, they're finding out that when we actually consider the entirety of the chimpanzee and human genome, we're really only about 88% similar genetically. And that translates into like 400 million DNA differences. Okay, so what we have is a huge number of fixation events. Fixed in genetics just means to get stuck in place. Okay, so we need a huge multitude of fixation events since the split about 6 million years ago between humans and chimpanzees. We know fixation for the most part is relatively slow. So what there is something called a waiting time problem to even get enough fixation events since the split between humans and chimps for human evolution to even be true. But more so recently, when you can see the paper here, chimpanzee, this is a secular paper, this isn't young earth creation. Chimpanzee and human Y chromosomes are remarkably divergent in structure and gene content. So here's what's interesting, is the Y chromosome is non-recombining DNA, okay? We only inherit that DNA compartment from our father. With the nuclear DNA, there's recombination, right? So it recombines, it scrambles, a little more messy. So the Y chromosome should be relatively more stable. So when they sequenced the chimpanzee Y chromosome and human Y chromosome and compared it, they were shocked. They were shocked that, notice here, more than 30% of the chimp Y chromosome lacks an alignable counterpart on the human Y chromosome and vice versa. Page's team found that chimp Y chromosome has only 2/3 as many distinct genes or gene families as the human Y chromosome, and only 47% as many protein coding elements as humans. So point is, the Y chromosome between humans and chimpanzees is only about 35% the same. It's hugely different, massively divergent. Too many differences to explain in just 6 million years since the split. Because remember, you got to consider every single human Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical. That's how we can build these Y chromosome family trees, and we can trace our last Y chromosomal ancestor back to just 4,500 years ago, because there's low variation. But then the Y chromosome between humans and chimps is only about 35% the same. I mean, how are they going to explain that? Point is, that's exactly what we would expect from a creationist. But it's the genetics that is actually contradictory to the ape to man evolutionary story. So even the genetics is not on their side. The genetics themselves, the genetic data is refuting them. So if they go to the fossil record, okay, they're using fossils and bones to build a story that's not consistent with the genetics. The genetics comes first. That's the direct way to answer this question of ancestry. So they want to overturn the genetic data with their bones found in the dirt, their bone fragments. You see how circular and you see how unscientific that is?
Yeah, that I didn't know this part, but this is just beautiful. I mean, It's like a nail in the coffin.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, I've debated PhDs on this, and I've brought it up to them, and their best explanation is chimpanzees have had a wild sex life from generation to generation, where they have multiple partners, and therefore, you know, the sperm in their genetics on the male side is doing some crazy things enough to explain the divergence. But you know, this is all just a guessing game, all a hypothesis. They even admit this is a hypothesis. Put it this way. Okay, they say that our closest cousin is the chimpanzee, okay? It turns out that our Y chromosome as a human is more similar to the gorilla Y chromosome than it is to the chimpanzee Y chromosome. Well, that ruins their hierarchy. It should be humans and chimpanzees that are closer. Why in the world do we have the gorilla closer to us? And they'll say, well, it's the chimpanzees, the odd man out, because of their interesting polygamous way of mating all throughout history. You know, just stories, of course, to explain the data. But I mean, there's another nail in the coffin, right?
Yeah, but so if I understood you correctly, the Y does not really recombine correctly. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's what's called by genetics uniparentally inherited DNA compartment. Just means that it's only inherited for, like, for example, we got our Y chromosome from our father. We got our mitochondrial DNA from our mother. So there's two non-recombining DNA compartments.
Okay, yeah. So technically, it doesn't matter how many partners they would have. It wouldn't really change the Y, and you know, so their theory wouldn't really hold water.
It may degenerate it a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, there wouldn't be any recombination as a factor here. But they could also say, so we know that the Y chromosome actually mutates really fast. So here's a technical paper from Dr. Nathaniel Jensen. He's a Harvard graduate. He works at Answers in Genesis. And he looked at high quality mutation rate studies on the Y chromosome, and he realized that the Y chromosome mutates really fast, way more fast, like about 1 per generation. So this is the title of the paper. He demonstrated that the Y chromosome mutation rate and the number of DNA differences in the Y chromosome suggests a 4,500 year history, which is perfect because that brings us back to Noah, our last Y chromosomal ancestor. So the evolutionists will say, well, okay, the Y chromosome mutates fast. So that explains why the chimpanzee and human Y chromosome is so different. When in fact, it actually makes the problem worse for them. Because think about this. The Y chromosome mutates really fast, right? But when we actually examine Y chromosome diversity worldwide, we've realized that the Y chromosome, no matter what population you look at, it's the same. I mean, there's very low variation, very low differences in the human Y chromosome. So how in the world do you have a very quickly mutating Y chromosome that's also nearly identical worldwide? It should be different. There should be divergent people groups. There should be more diversity. Well, you want to know why? It's because it's young. It only goes back 4,500 years. So although it's fast, there's only been 4,500 years of a fast mutation rate. Does that make sense? It has to be young if it's fast and there's low variation. Because if it went back a couple 100,000 years, well, that would be a couple 100,000 years where we have mutations accumulating in the Y chromosome, which means the Y chromosome should have high diversity. So that actually doesn't help them either. That actually makes the problem worse. So like you said, it's nail after nail after nail in the coffin for the evolutionists.
Yeah, so it's interesting because even if that was the case, it would not just have to, like, a certain line of chimps have to be changed. They would all would have to have a similar, like pretty much one person's completely changed or one, animal changed, and everybody followed that. Everybody else died out, right? Because if it wasn't, it would still, they'd be closer to us than,
Oh yeah,
35%.
Oh yeah, it should be way. I mean, our Y chromosome is only like half the size of the chimpanzee Y chromosome. The architecture, gene content, totally different. For example, Call Me Emo in the chat says what I just said. He's an evolutionist. So here's his rescue device. He says, actually, it's the chimpanzee's Y chromosome that is significantly different. He says mainly due to losses. And that's what I said earlier, right? Is that's their story. It's the chimpanzees, the odd man out. And everybody else's Y chromosome is normal. When no, that's contradictory. The human Y chromosome mutates really fast. So if what Call Me Emo is saying is true, okay, that it's only the chimpanzee Y chromosome that's doing some wild things enough to make it so different. then we should find highly divergent people groups on this planet where the Y chromosomes are quite divergent. Okay, but no, we find one singular Y chromosome worldwide. I think there's about maybe 300 at most. It would be the max differences between any two people. So if you have a mutation rate in the Y chromosome that's 1 per generation, you can easily explain the maximum diversity in the Y chromosome in just 4,500 years. If what Call Me Emo is saying is true, we should find much more divergence in human Y chromosomes, and we don't find that. So every one of their stories and rescue devices is actually refuted by the empirical data. Like we can make a prediction. Like we can look to their rescue device and say, okay, that'll lead to a prediction. Let's see if it's true. And we find out it's false every single time.
Yeah, and another thing that you guys were talking about was the specifics of, like speciation, let's say it that way, how you can have one animal that, breaks down into, like, let's say there was a pre-cheetah, and now that is broke down into different cats. And you can technically explain it by the genetic code degenerating quickly. Yet we don't see that in humans. It's literally staying pretty similar if you look at it in that sense.
Right. Yeah. It's very similar. Right here. All human beings are 99.9% similar, identical in their genetic makeup. I mean, isn't that fascinating? Apparently, we've been evolving for millions of years, and yet we're 99.9% the same. And I was pointing out to Jackson, I was trying to find, I've got thousands of slides, so sometimes it's hard to find the exact paper, but here we go. Inbred Neanderthals left humans a genetic burden. Remember, he was talking about how, Neanderthals are slightly different than us in their DNA. Well, of course, they were the most inbred people group on the planet. Their rungs of homozygosity are amazing. And the systems and the environments that they lived in this cold glacial type of ecosystem where the environment changed their genetics. The environment actually changed their morphology. That's why they're built the way they are, because they're adapted to that cold environment. So of course we predict them to be slightly different, but overall they're 99.7% the same to us. Meanwhile, chimpanzees are 88% the same. Call Me Emo in the chat. Look at this. He's going all the way to rats. So his rescue device now is this. Look, he says, Standing, do I have to bring up those rats again? So he's pointing out that there's rat species within the same genus that have massive differences, right? Well, when you look to rats and mice, just have a look at their reproductive rates, have a look at their generation times. I mean, they can recover populations quickly. Kind of like rabbits, they'll say breed like rabbits, right? But we're talking about humans. And he wants to, on the phylogenetic tree, he wants to go all the way down to rats and show that the Y chromosome is doing some pretty crazy things there. He's missing the point. Yeah, I admit the Y chromosome is mutating really fast. But you have to answer the question, then why is the Y chromosome so similar in every human male on the planet? If it's as wild as they say, and it mutates as fast as we know, then it should be, I think this makes sense on the panel, right? If we're accumulating that many mutations, then if we really do go back a couple 100,000 years, it shouldn't be as similar as it is. But no, it's very much similar because the Y chromosome's only a few thousand years old. So that's really
that makes perfect sense.